I was 5 years old when my mother looked me in the eyes, told me to wait just 1 minute, and walked away forever. Through the mall windows, I watched my parents drive off without a backward glance, abandoning me like trash they were too lazy to throw away properly. But a stranger named Richard saw me shaking on that bench. He took me home. He raised me. He loved me. And when he died 30 years later, I discovered the man who saved my life had been hiding a fortune, leaving me $2.7 million in his will. That's when they came back. The parents who threw me away suddenly remembered I existed the moment my inheritance hit the news. They hired a lawyer, fabricated a sob story about their stolen daughter, and dragged me into court demanding every penny. They thought I was still that helpless little girl. But as I sat at the defendant's table watching them smirk and whisper about how they'd bleed me dry, their attorney walked into the courtroom. His eyes landed on me. His face went white, and then he said the 5 words that made the entire room go silent. "Good morning, Judge Newman." They didn't know who I'd become. They had no idea what Richard had helped me build. And they definitely didn't expect what I had waiting for them. Stay with me, because what happened next in that courtroom didn't just destroy their case. It exposed 30 years of lies, shattered a family's fake history, and proved that the child they abandoned had become the one person they should have never underestimated. This is the story of how I made them pay for every single second they left me waiting. My name is Erica Newman. I'm 35 years old, and I serve as a magistrate judge in the district where I grew up. People who meet me now see someone composed, professional, someone who's built a life of purpose and meaning. But what they don't see is the 5-year-old girl I used to be, the one who learned on a cold November day in 1993 that the people who were supposed to love you most could walk away without looking back. That day started like any other Saturday. My mother woke me early, telling me we were going to the mall. I remember being excited because we almost never went anywhere as a family. I put on my purple coat, the one with the broken zipper that never stayed closed, and grabbed my stuffed rabbit, the one with the missing eye that I'd named Mr. Hoppy. My father barely acknowledged me as we piled into the car, but that wasn't unusual. He rarely spoke to me unless it was to tell me to be quiet or stay out of his way. The drive to Westfield Mall took 20 minutes. I pressed my face against the cold window, watching the world blur past, imagining all the toys I might see. My mother had promised nothing, but in my 5-year-old mind, going to the mall meant possibilities. Maybe she'd buy me something. Maybe we'd eat at the food court. Maybe for once they'd seem happy to have me around. When we arrived, my mother took my hand and led me through the entrance. The mall was busy that Saturday afternoon, filled with the sounds of holiday shopping, even though Thanksgiving hadn't arrived yet. Christmas decorations already hung from the ceiling, twinkling lights that made everything feel magical. My mother walked with purpose, not stopping to window shop or letting me pause to look at anything. My father trailed behind us, his hands in his pockets, his expression distant as always. Then we reached the toy section of the department store. Rows and rows of dolls, action figures, board games, and stuffed animals stretched out before me like a wonderland. My mother crouched down to my level, and for a moment, I thought she might actually smile at me. Instead, she adjusted my coat and said, "Stay right here, sweetie. Mommy needs to use the restroom. I'll be back in 1 minute. Count to 60, okay?" I nodded eagerly, clutching Mr. Hoppy tighter against my chest. Counting to 60 was something I could do. I was good at counting. She stood up, touched the top of my head briefly, and walked away. I watched her purple sweater disappear into the crowd. Then I started counting. 1, 2, 3. I counted slowly, carefully, making sure I didn't skip any numbers. 4, 5, 6. Shoppers moved around me like a river flowing past a stone. 7, 8, 9. A mother and daughter walked by the little girl, laughing as she pointed at a toy. 10, 11, 12. When I reached 60, I stopped and waited. My mother had said 1 minute. But she didn't appear. I counted to 60 again, thinking maybe I'd counted too fast the first time. Still nothing. The bright fluorescent lights of the toy aisle, which had seemed so exciting moments before, now felt too bright, almost harsh. I shifted my weight from foot to foot, hugging Mr. Ye. Hoppy closer. I counted to 60 a third time, then a fourth. Other children ran past me with their parents pointing at toys, begging for things, being told yes or no or maybe. But they all had someone with them. I stood alone in my spot, too scared to move, too scared to call out. What if I left, and my mother came back and couldn't find me? What if I got in trouble for not staying where she told me 10 minutes passed, then 20, then longer? I didn't have a watch, couldn't read a clock yet, so I didn't know exactly how much time went by. I just knew it was more than 1 minute. Much more. My legs started to hurt from standing still. My hands felt cold even though I was inside. A store employee walked past me twice, glancing at me with a concerned expression, but I didn't know how to explain that I was waiting for my mommy without sounding like a baby. Then I saw them. Through the large glass windows at the front of the mall, I spotted my mother's purple sweater. She was walking across the parking lot, not running, not looking around frantically like she'd lost something. Just walking. My father was beside her, his hands still in his pockets, his stride casual and unhurried. They were leaving. My small hand rose instinctively in a wave, a desperate gesture of recognition. Maybe they'd forgotten something in the car. Maybe they were coming right back. My mother's head turned slightly, and for one brief moment our eyes met across the distance. I waited for her expression to change, for panic to set in, for her to realize she'd left me inside. But her face showed nothing like that. No alarm, no sudden awareness of a terrible mistake. Instead, there was something cold in her eyes, something final and resolved, like she was confirming a decision she'd already made long before we arrived. Then she turned away and kept walking. My father never looked back at all. I watched them reach a sedan I recognized as ours. I watched them open the doors, climb inside, close the doors. I watched the car pull out of the parking space, watched the red taillights grow smaller as it merged into traffic, watched until it disappeared completely from view. That's when I understood, in the way that children understand things they don't yet have words for. I'd been left behind on purpose. I don't remember starting to cry, but I must have, because a security guard knelt beside me asking me questions I couldn't answer through my sobbing. Eventually, they took me to a small office with gray walls and uncomfortable chairs. They gave me juice and crackers. They asked for my name, my parents' names, my address. I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much. What I didn't know was that above my head, silent cameras had recorded everything. The timestamp read 2:47 p.m. when my mother led me into the toy section and told me to wait. At 2:51 p.m., exactly 4 minutes later, those same cameras captured my parents exiting the building. The footage showed a mall employee intercepting them near the doors, clearly asking them something. My father waved dismissively. My mother shook her head and said something brief. Then they walked out. The security team would review that footage that evening, playing it over and over, trying to understand what they were witnessing. It wasn't a tragic accident. It wasn't a momentary lapse. It was deliberate, calculated abandonment, captured frame by frame on mall security tape. But that night, something else would happen that none of us could have predicted. And that night, someone else watching the footage would make a life-changing choice. The security office felt smaller as the hours passed. I sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair, my legs dangling above the floor, still clutching Mr. Hoppy against my chest. The security guards had been kind enough offering me snacks and trying to make me comfortable, but I could see the worry in their eyes. They'd made phone calls, filled out paperwork, asked me the same questions over and over as if my answers might change. They hadn't. By the time evening approached, I'd stopped crying. I just felt numb, hollow, like something important had been carved out of me and nothing had been put back in its place. Through the office window, I could see shoppers walking past, carrying bags, holding hands with their children, living normal lives that suddenly seemed impossibly far from mine. That's when I first saw him. A man in his mid-50s stood near the bench outside the security office, not staring directly at me, but clearly aware of my presence. He wore a simple gray sweater and khaki pants. Nothing remarkable, but there was something gentle about his face. His eyes were kind in a way that felt real, not forced. His hands looked weathered, like they'd worked hard for many years, but they rested calmly in his lap as he sat and simply waited. I watched him through the glass as security guards and mall staff continued their attempts to figure out what to do with me. He didn't rush forward or try to insert himself into the situation. He just sat there patient and still, as if he had all the time in the world. Every so often, our eyes would meet and he'd offer me a small, soft smile, not the kind of smile adults use when they're trying to make children behave, but the kind that says, everything might somehow be okay. After what felt like a long time, he stood up slowly and approached the security office door. He knocked gently and spoke quietly with one of the guards. I couldn't hear what they said, but I watched the guard nod and gesture toward me. The man asked permission to speak with me, and after a brief hesitation, they allowed it. He entered the small office, moving carefully as if aware that sudden movements might frighten me. He didn't tower over me or crouch in that exaggerated way some adults do when they talk to children. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat down so we were at eye level. For a moment, he didn't say anything at all. Then he asked in a voice that was gentle and genuinely curious. "Are you cold? Would you like some hot chocolate?" It was such a simple question, so different from all the procedural inquiries I'd been answering for hours. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He stood, spoke briefly with the security staff, and returned a few minutes later with 2 cups of hot chocolate from the mall cafe. He handed me one, waited for me to take a tentative sip, then took a sip from his own. "My name is Richard," he said. "Richard Hale." I whispered my name in return so quietly I wasn't sure he heard me, but he nodded as if he had. We sat together in the mall's small cafe, away from the bustle of the security office. Richard didn't ask me what happened or why I was alone. He didn't probe or push. Instead, he told me something I would never forget. When I was 6 years old, he began, his voice soft and steady. I lived in an orphanage. It was a big building with lots of children, lots of noise, lots of people around all the time. But I felt completely alone. I remember what it felt like to be alone in a room full of people. I remember thinking that nobody saw me. Not really. I was just there taking up space, waiting for something that never came. His words settled over me like a blanket. He understood. Somehow this stranger understood the exact feeling that had been suffocating me all day. The loneliness that exists even when you're surrounded by others. The invisibility that comes from being unwanted. "I'm very sorry this happened to you," Richard continued, looking directly into my eyes. "You deserved better. You deserve better." Something about the way he said it made me believe him. Not deserve past tense like it was already over. Deserve present tense like there was still possibility ahead. Richard stayed with me as the security staff continued making calls. He stayed as police arrived and took statements. He stayed as they explained that no missing child reports matched my description, that my parents hadn't reported me missing, that social services would need to be contacted but wouldn't arrive until morning. He stayed through all of it, this stranger who owed me nothing. When the police asked if anyone could take me for the night while they sorted out the paperwork, Richard volunteered immediately. "I can provide temporary care until this is resolved," he said. The police ran a background check, made phone calls, confirmed his identity and address. Everything came back clean. They were desperate for a solution, and Richard was offering one. He drove me to his home as darkness settled over the city. His house was modest, a small 2-bedroom with wooden floors that creaked gently when you walked. It smelled like old books and lemon polish, tidy and warm in a way my own house had never been. He showed me around briefly, then prepared a simple dinner, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. I ate slowly, still not quite believing any of this was real. After dinner, he gave me a pair of his old pajamas to wear. They hung on my small frame like a tent, the sleeves going past my hands, the pants pooling around my feet. He folded the cuffs up carefully, then showed me to a spare bedroom. The bed was made with clean white sheets, and there was a nightlight plugged into the wall that cast a soft yellow glow. Before I climbed into bed, Richard knelt beside me one more time. "You're safe here," he said, and his voice carried a weight of promise. "Whatever happens tomorrow tonight, you're safe. Can you trust me on that?" I nodded, too exhausted to speak. He stood, moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. "If you need anything during the night, my room is right across the hall. Don't be afraid to wake me." He left the door slightly open, and I lay in that unfamiliar bed clutching Mr. Hoppy, listening to the sounds of a stranger's house settling around me. For the first time all day, I felt like maybe I could breathe. He'd made me a promise that I was safe tonight, and somehow I believed he would keep it. But Richard's past would someday twist itself into Erica's fate. That first night became a second night, then a week, then longer. Social services came by, asked questions, filled out paperwork. They searched for my parents, tried to locate relatives, explored options. But no one came forward. My parents never filed a missing person report, never contacted the police, never called the mall to ask if anyone had found a lost child. They'd simply vanished from my life as deliberately as they'd left me in that toy section. Richard never pushed me to talk about what happened. He simply let me exist in his home, giving me space to heal at my own pace. And slowly, day by day, I discovered what safety actually felt like. Dinner became something I looked forward to rather than dreaded. Every evening at 6 o'clock, Richard would set the table and we'd sit down together. He'd ask me about my day, and he actually listened to my answers. Not the distracted half-listening of adults who asked out of obligation, but genuine interest. He'd ask follow-up questions, laugh at my stories about things I'd seen or imagined, and share small details about his own day in return. There was no yelling, no tense silences, no feeling like I had to make myself invisible to avoid setting someone off. Bedtime transformed, too. Richard would read to me every night, sitting in the chair beside my bed with a book in his lap. He read with patient voices for different characters, never rushing through the pages, never making me feel like I was keeping him from something more important. On nights when I woke up from nightmares, trembling and disoriented, I'd find him already at my door, having heard me stir. He'd sit with me until I fell back asleep, sometimes reading more, sometimes just being present. The mornings were perhaps the most revelatory. Richard woke at the same time every day, and I'd hear him moving through the house with quiet, predictable routines. He'd make coffee, hum softly to himself while preparing breakfast, and greet me with the same gentle "good morning," whether I appeared cheerful or withdrawn. There was no volatility, no wondering what mood I'd encounter. He was steady, reliable, safe. These small consistencies, which might seem unremarkable to a child who'd always had them, rebuilt something fundamental in me that had been shattered. I started calling the house home in my mind, though it took much longer to say it out loud. I learned that family didn't have to mean the people whose blood you shared. It could mean someone who chose you, who showed up for you every single day, who made you feel like your presence mattered. The nightmares that had plagued my first weeks with Richard began to fade, replaced gradually by dreams, where I felt safe, where I belonged. What I didn't know was that Richard's home had security cameras. He'd installed them years before I arrived, after a break-in had left him feeling vulnerable. The cameras were small, unobtrusive, positioned in the living room, kitchen, and hallways. Richard never mentioned them because he didn't want me to feel watched or monitored. He wanted me to feel free to be myself, to heal without the weight of observation. But those cameras captured everything anyway. They recorded the first time I laughed genuinely about 3 months after I'd arrived, when Richard had tried to flip a pancake and it landed on the floor instead of the pan. They captured the evening 6 months in, when I said, "Good night, Dad," instead of "Good night, Richard." And the way he'd paused in the doorway, his eyes bright with emotion he was trying to contain. They documented me running to hug him when he returned from business trips, the way I'd started helping him cook dinner, the countless small moments of connection that proved our bond was real and deep, and built on genuine love. Those recordings sat on a hard drive, unmarked and unexamined, a silent archive of healing that neither of us knew would matter decades later. Richard enrolled me in school that fall, handling all the paperwork and meetings with administrators. He never pressured me to talk about my past with teachers or counselors, respecting my privacy, even when well-meaning adults suggested I needed to process my trauma through discussion. He knew I'd talk when I was ready, and he wouldn't force it before then. He showed up for everything. Every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every science fair. He volunteered to chaperone field trips, helped organize fundraisers, and became a familiar presence in the school community. When my second-grade teacher pulled him aside to mention I seemed to struggle with attachment issues, becoming anxious when he left me at school or picked me up late, Richard found me a therapist. Not someone harsh or clinical, but a gentle woman named Dr. Marie, who let me play with toys while we talked, and never made me feel broken. When I excelled in my classes, Richard encouraged my curiosity. He'd take me to the library every Saturday, letting me check out as many books as I could carry. He'd help me with homework without doing it for me, teaching me to think through problems rather than just giving me answers. He never pushed me toward achievement for its own sake, or made me feel like I had to earn his love through good grades. He just supported whatever interested me, whatever made me feel capable and confident. Richard never once tried to replace my parents or erase them from my story. He never spoke badly about them, never made me feel guilty for whatever complicated feelings I had about being abandoned. Instead, he simply built something new with me, a relationship founded on respect and consistency and choice. He showed me through his actions that trust could be rebuilt, that not all adults would leave, that my worth existed independent of what my biological parents had decided about me. I learned to believe I deserved good things. I learned that love could be steady and unconditional. I learned that home wasn't a place, but a feeling of safety you carried inside, you built by someone who showed up every single day and meant it. But the past always finds a way back. I was 14 when everything crystallized for me, when the scattered pieces of my experience suddenly arranged themselves into a clear path forward. Richard and I were watching television on a Tuesday evening, flipping through channels looking for something interesting, when we landed on a documentary about family law and the child welfare system. I almost asked him to keep changing channels, but something made me stop. The documentary followed several cases of children caught in custody battles, adoption proceedings, and abuse situations. It showed lawyers arguing before judges, social workers making difficult decisions, and children waiting in foster care for someone to decide their futures. As I watched, something fundamental shifted inside me. I realized that legal systems existed specifically to protect children like I had been. There were people whose entire jobs involved standing up for kids who couldn't stand up for themselves. There were laws designed to ensure children had safety, stability, and advocates. I became obsessed. I started checking out books from the library about family law, juvenile justice, and child advocacy. I read court cases online, trying to understand the language and logic of legal arguments. I wanted to know everything about how courts decided custody, how adoption worked, what legally constituted abandonment versus kidnapping. The questions that had haunted me since I was 5 finally had frameworks, precedents, answers. Richard noticed my intense focus but didn't interrupt it. He'd find me at the kitchen table late at night, surrounded by printed articles and library books, taking notes in a spiral notebook. Finally, one evening, he sat down across from me and asked gently, "What interests you so much about all of this?" I looked up at him, trying to find the right words. "The law protected me when my real parents didn't," I said slowly. "When I was left in that mall, the system stepped in. Social workers got involved. You were able to adopt me legally. There were rules that made sure I didn't just disappear. Maybe I can do that for other kids. Maybe I can be the person who stands up for children who need someone." Richard's eyes shone with tears he wouldn't let fall. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Then that's what you'll do," he said simply, without hesitation or doubt. He didn't tell me I was too young to make such a big decision. He didn't suggest I consider more practical careers or warn me about how difficult law school would be. He didn't dismiss my calling as a teenage phase that I'd grow out of. He just believed me immediately and completely, and that belief became the foundation I built everything else on. Throughout high school and college, I threw myself into academics with singular determination. I wasn't naturally brilliant, the kind of student who could glide through classes without effort. Instead, I worked relentlessly, staying up late to study, rewriting papers until they were perfect, preparing obsessively for exams. My drive came from something deeper than ambition or competition. I was building armor, creating credentials, making myself into someone who would never be powerless again. But my trauma didn't make me cold or calculating. If anything, it made me more empathetic, more attuned to suffering, more committed to protecting the vulnerable. I joined the mock trial team in high school and became known for taking on cases that defended the underdog. When we practiced arguments, I didn't just cite precedent and statutes. I made the judges feel what was at stake, helped them understand the human cost of their decisions. My college professors wrote in recommendation letters that I argued cases as if lives depended on my words. They were right. In my mind, every legal brief I wrote was personal. Every argument I constructed was a promise to the 5-year-old girl I'd been the one who'd stood alone in a toy section wondering why she wasn't worth keeping. I was promising her that I would never let another child feel that way without someone fighting for them, that I would use every skill I developed to stand between vulnerable children and the people who would harm or abandon them. Richard attended everything. Every mock trial competition, every moot court presentation, every academic ceremony. He'd sit quietly in the back row, always with a leather-bound journal in his lap. I'd see him writing during my performances, and I assumed he was just taking notes or passing time. What I didn't know was that he was documenting my journey with the care of someone preserving something precious. Years later, I would find those journals locked in a drawer in his study. Page after page filled with his observations about my growth, my arguments, my compassion. Today, Erica argued for a child's right to stability. One entry read, "She didn't just cite precedent. She made the judges feel what abandonment means. She transformed legal theory into human experience. I have never been more proud." Another entry from my second year of law school. Watched Erica defend a hypothetical case involving parental neglect. She was fierce, precise, devastating in her logic. But she never lost sight of the child at the center of the case. She fought for that imaginary child as if it were herself at 5 years old. She has taken her pain and forged it into purpose. This is what redemption looks like. He never showed me these journals while he was alive. They were his private documentation of watching a wounded child transform into a warrior for justice, his way of honoring the privilege of witnessing my healing and growth. They were love letters written to no one and everyone, proof that a father's pride doesn't require biology, that chosen family can run deeper than blood. I graduated law school in the top 5% of my class. I passed the bar exam on my first attempt. I became a prosecutor specializing in family law and child welfare cases, handling the kinds of situations that would have broken other lawyers. I won cases that protected children from abuse, secured adoptions for kids in foster care, and held neglectful parents accountable. Every victory felt personal because it was. Richard was there for all of it, sitting in courtrooms when he could, calling to hear about my cases, celebrating my successes, and supporting me through the difficult losses. He never took credit for any of it, never suggested that my achievements were reflections of his parenting. He simply loved me and believed in me and gave me the stability I needed to become who I was meant to be. But while I was building a life devoted to justice and protection, somewhere else, 2 people lived comfortably inside a lie. While I was building a career protecting children and seeking justice, my biological parents were building something entirely different, a comprehensive lie that would sustain them for 3 decades. I wouldn't learn the full scope of their deception until much later. But when I finally pieced it together, the calculated nature of it took my breath away. From the moment they drove away from Westfield Mall in 1993, Daniel and Patricia Newman began crafting a narrative that would protect them from judgment, shield them from consequences, and allow them to live as victims rather than perpetrators. They told everyone the same story, perfecting it with repetition until it became smoother than truth. Their daughter had been kidnapped from a mall. They'd only turned their backs for a moment. When they returned, she was gone. They'd searched, frantically called police, spent sleepless nights imagining the worst. Eventually, they'd been forced to accept that they might never know what happened to their little girl. Their neighbors absorbed this tragedy with appropriate sympathy. Some brought casseroles and offered shoulders to cry on. Others organized fundraisers for missing children's organizations in Erica's name, believing they were honoring a family's unspeakable loss. Their church held annual prayers for my safe return, lighting candles and asking God to bring the missing child home. Daniel and Patricia attended these services with bowed heads and carefully maintained expressions of grief. The lie became so rehearsed that even they seemed to half believe it. Patricia perfected a sad smile that appeared whenever anyone mentioned children. Daniel developed a distant gaze as if looking at something painful only he could see. They knew exactly how long to let conversations about me linger before changing the subject with brave resignation. They'd crafted personas as wounded parents who carried their tragedy with quiet dignity. But beneath the performance was nothing but air. They never filed a missing persons report. They never hired private investigators or appeared on news programs appealing for information. They never organized actual search parties or distributed flyers with my photo. Their search for me existed only in conversation in the stories they told to maintain their victim status. The frantic effort they described to others never manifested in any documented action. In 1996, 3 years after abandoning me, Patricia gave birth to another daughter. They named her Sarah, and with her arrival came a new dimension to their deception. Sarah would grow up in the shadow of a sister she'd never met, raised on a ghost story that shaped her entire understanding of her family. "You had a big sister named Erica," they told her when she was old enough to ask about the sad undercurrent in their home. "When you were a baby, bad people took her from us. We looked everywhere, but we never found her. She's gone, and we don't know if she's alive or not." Sarah absorbed this mythology as truth. She grew up believing herself the surviving child of a tragic family, the daughter who remained after the other was stolen away. She interpreted her parents' financial struggles as consequences of their loss, imagined their emotional distance as the result of hearts too broken to fully open again. She carried guilt for being the one they kept wondering sometimes in her darkest moments if they wished it had been her who disappeared instead. She never questioned why there were no photos of me displayed in their home, why they discouraged her from researching missing children's cases, why they became uncomfortable when she asked for specific memories of her lost sister. The lie was so complete, so consistent, that Sarah never thought to doubt it. It defined her identity. She was the daughter who remained marked by a family tragedy that preceded her birth. Meanwhile, Daniel and Patricia's lives spiraled downward in ways that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with character. Without the responsibility of 2 children, they didn't thrive or redirect their energy into positive channels. Instead, they deteriorated. Daniel moved from job to job, never holding a position for more than a couple of years. His gambling addiction, which had existed long before they abandoned me, grew worse without the constraint of needing to provide for 2 children. He'd spend entire paychecks at casinos, convinced the next bet would solve all their problems. Patricia enabled his behavior, making excuses to employers and family members, covering for his absences and failures. She had her own compulsions. Credit card debt accumulated through shopping sprees that provided temporary relief from whatever emptiness plagued her. She'd buy things they didn't need and couldn't afford, filling their home with purchases that never quite satisfied whatever she was seeking. They refinanced their house multiple times over the years, pulling equity out to cover debts, always one financial crisis away from foreclosure. Their marriage became cold and functional, sustained not by love or partnership, but by their shared deception. They needed each other to maintain the lie, to corroborate the story, to keep the facade intact. In private, they never discussed me except to rehearse the public narrative they'd present to others. I was the child they didn't mention between themselves, the unspoken truth they'd agreed to bury. Acknowledging what they'd actually done would have shattered their carefully constructed denial, would have forced them to see themselves as something other than victims of circumstance. So they ran from the truth for 30 years. They didn't run toward anything better or build anything meaningful. They just ran using me as an excuse for every failure, every bad decision, every disappointment. I was their tragedy and their alibi, the missing piece that explained why their lives never quite worked out. Sarah grew up watching this slow-motion collapse, interpreting it through the lens of the lie they'd fed her. She thought she understood her parents' struggles. She thought she knew her family's story. She had no idea that everything she believed was built on a foundation of deliberate cruelty and systematic deception. They'd gotten away with it for 3 decades. They'd convinced their community, their church, their own daughter. They'd transformed abandonment into tragedy, cruelty into misfortune, choice into circumstance. And one broadcast would shatter their silence. While my biological parents were living inside their carefully maintained fiction, I was building something real. I graduated law school in the top 5% of my class, earned multiple honors, and received offers from several prestigious firms. But I turned them all down. Corporate law, intellectual property disputes, and contract negotiations held no appeal for me. I had a different calling. I joined the district attorney's office with fierce determination, starting in the family law division, where I'd always known I belonged. My colleagues quickly noticed that I approached cases differently than most prosecutors. I was aggressive in pursuing justice, relentless in building cases against abusers and neglectors, but I was never cruel. I didn't grandstand or use victims' pain as theater for my own advancement. I was strategic without being manipulative, passionate without being reckless. I specialized in child welfare cases, the kinds that would break other prosecutors and send them transferring to different divisions within months. I handled cases involving children found in drug houses, kids beaten by the people who were supposed to protect them, neglect so severe it constituted torture. Other attorneys would come out of these cases hardened or devastated. But I came out more determined. Every child I helped was the 5-year-old me, and I would not fail them. By the time I was 32, I'd convicted numerous abusers, secured permanent removal orders for countless neglected children, and earned a reputation as the prosecutor who actually cared. My colleagues called me that sometimes with admiration, and sometimes with a hint of criticism, as if caring too much was a liability in our profession. But I knew the truth caring was exactly what made me effective. I could look at bruised children and shattered families and still see the humanity in it all, still fight for what was right, without becoming cynical or numb. My trial record was exceptional. I prepared meticulously for every case anticipated, every defense strategy, and presented evidence with clarity and emotional intelligence that made juries understand what was truly at stake. I won cases that other prosecutors thought were unwinnable because I refused to give up on children who'd already been given up on too many times. When a position for magistrate judge opened in our district, several senior attorneys encouraged me to apply. I hesitated, thinking I was too young at 35, that I needed more years of experience before taking on such responsibility. But my mentors insisted, and when the selection committee reviewed my record, they saw someone who combined legal brilliance with genuine compassion. I was appointed as one of the youngest magistrate judges in the district's history, a position that typically went to attorneys with 10 or 15 more years of experience than I had. The role came with significant responsibility. I would oversee preliminary hearings, issue warrants, handle certain civil matters, and make decisions that affected real people's lives every single day. I took that weight seriously, never forgetting that behind every case file was a human story, often a painful one. But no matter how demanding my career became, I never let it consume everything. Richard had taught me that success meant nothing if you forgot the people who mattered, and he mattered more than anything else in my life. As Richard aged, I made sure I was present. I visited him twice a week for dinner, sitting at the same kitchen table where he'd once helped me with homework and listened to my dreams. I called him every evening, even if just for 5 minutes, checking in and hearing his voice. When he needed to go to medical appointments, I rearranged my schedule to accompany him, sitting in waiting rooms and asking doctors the questions he was too proud or too tired to ask. When colleagues asked about my family, I spoke about Richard with unmistakable love and pride. My dad saved my life. I'd say simply, and I meant it in every possible way. I never mentioned my biological parents. That chapter was closed, sealed, irrelevant to who I'd become. Richard was my family wholly and completely, the only parent who mattered, the person whose opinion I valued above all others. I'd been saving money for years with a specific plan in mind. When Richard could no longer live independently, I would move him into my home. I would care for him the way he'd cared for me, repaying even a fraction of what he'd given. Our bond was the foundation of my entire identity, proof that family was about choice and commitment, not biology. He'd chosen me when I was at my most vulnerable, and I would choose him every day for the rest of his life. Beyond my work and my relationship with Richard, I became involved in my community in ways that extended my impact. I volunteered at youth centers, talking to teenagers about their futures and their rights. I mentored young women entering law school, particularly those from difficult backgrounds, who needed someone to believe in them the way Richard had believed in me. People began recognizing me at grocery stores, at coffee shops, at community events. They'd approach me to thank me for my work, to tell me about cases I'd handled that had touched their families, to express appreciation for having someone in the system who seemed to genuinely care. I received letters from families I'd helped, letters I kept in a special folder in my office and read when the work became overwhelming. I donated generously to children's charities and served on nonprofit boards focused on foster care reform. I used whatever influence and platform I had to advocate for better resources, better training for social workers, better outcomes for vulnerable children. My colleagues described me as tough but fair, someone whose compassion never compromised her judgment, but instead sharpened it. I'd become exactly what I'd promised myself. I would be the woman I'd needed when I was 5 years old. I was living proof that trauma doesn't have to create broken people, that it can instead create healers, protectors, warriors for the vulnerable. I'd taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and transformed it into purpose. I had built a life of meaning, surrounded myself with people who valued integrity and compassion, and created a career dedicated to ensuring that no child felt as alone as I once had. I felt fulfilled in ways I'd never imagined possible during those dark early years. But even the strongest hearts can break. Richard was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in early 2023, but he kept it from me for 3 months. I should have noticed something was wrong sooner. He'd always been so vibrant, so present, and suddenly he seemed tired, slower, less interested in our usual activities. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd wave off my concerns with practiced ease. "Just a small health issue," he'd say. "Nothing to worry about. You know how it is at my age." He refused to let me accompany him to doctor's appointments, insisting he was perfectly capable of managing on his own. "You're in your first year as a judge," he'd remind me. "You have enough on your plate without worrying about my routine checkups." I accepted his explanations because I trusted him completely, because he'd never lied to me before, and because I couldn't imagine he'd hide something serious from me. But he was hiding everything. He was carrying the knowledge of his terminal diagnosis alone, managing increasing pain with medications he took in private, maintaining an appearance of normalcy during our twice-weekly dinners, even as his body was actively dying. He did it, I learned later, because he remembered how I'd struggled with abandonment anxiety whenever he traveled for business when I was younger, how I'd call multiple times to make sure he was okay, how I'd have trouble sleeping until he returned. He feared that knowing his death was imminent would trigger those old wounds, would send me spiraling back to that 5-year-old girl standing alone in a mall. So he protected me in the only way he knew how. He carried the burden himself, believing this final deception was an act of mercy rather than a source of future regret. He didn't understand that I would have chosen to spend every remaining moment with him, that I would have wanted to be there through the difficult parts, not just the easy ones. By the time he could no longer hide how sick he was, by the time he finally entered hospice care in June 2023, it was almost too late. I received a call from his longtime attorney, Mr. Keller, explaining that Richard had been admitted to hospice and that I should come immediately. The drive to the facility felt endless, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind refusing to accept what I already knew to be true. When I arrived, Richard looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, his body diminished by illness, his skin pale and thin like paper. But his eyes were still kind, still the same eyes that had looked at me with such gentleness in that mall cafe 30 years ago. I took his hand, trying to be strong for him the way he'd always been strong for me, trying not to let him see how completely shattered I felt. His breathing was labored, each inhale an obvious effort. The hospice nurse had explained that he likely had hours, not days, and that the morphine would make communication difficult. I sat beside him, holding his hand, telling him everything I needed him to know. That he'd saved my life. That he was the best father anyone could have asked for. That I loved him more than I could ever properly express. He seemed to be drifting in and out of consciousness, but then his eyes opened and focused on me with sudden clarity. He squeezed my hand weakly and struggled to speak. "Erica?" He managed his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something. I need to tell you. I always knew they would." His voice faded, the effort of speaking too great. I leaned closer, my ear near his mouth, desperate to hear whatever he was trying to say. "What, Dad? What did you know?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle despite my urgency. But the moment of clarity had passed. His eyes closed again, his breathing becoming more irregular, more shallow. I watched his chest rise one last time, held my breath, waiting for the next inhale that never came. The silence that followed felt impossibly loud. He was gone, and I would never know what he'd been trying to tell me. That unfinished sentence haunted me immediately. I always knew they would. They would what? Come back. Find me. Try something. I spent the next weeks turning those words over in my mind, trying to understand what warning he'd been attempting to give, never imagining that he'd predicted the exact crisis that would soon descend on my life. I arranged his funeral according to the instructions he'd left with Mr. Keller. Small and dignified, no fuss or spectacle. Fewer than 20 people attended, mostly colleagues from my work, a few of Richard's neighbors, and Mr. Keller himself, who'd worked with Richard for decades and clearly cared for him deeply. I stood before that small gathering and delivered a brief eulogy, my voice steady, even as tears streamed down my face. "My father taught me that love is a choice you make every day," I said, looking at the simple casket that held the man who'd given me everything. "He chose me when no one else would. He chose me every single day for 30 years, and I'll spend the rest of my life honoring that choice." I'd brought something with me to bury with him. Mr. Hoppy, the worn stuffed rabbit I'd been clutching that day in the mall when Richard first approached me. I'd kept it all these years preserved in my closet as a reminder of where I'd come from. It seemed right that it should go with Richard, completing the circle of the story we'd shared. He'd saved the little girl who held that rabbit, and now that rabbit would stay with him. The funeral ended quietly. People offered condolences, shared brief memories, and slowly dispersed. I stayed longer than anyone else, standing beside the grave as workers prepared to lower the casket, not quite ready to leave him behind. I went home to an empty house that felt too quiet, too still. I'd lost the only real parent I'd ever known, and the grief was overwhelming in its completeness. But I had my work, my purpose, the life he'd helped me build. I would carry on because that's what he would have wanted. I would honor his memory by continuing to do the work he'd been so proud of. I had no idea that everything was about to change. And then came the televised will reading. The months after Richard's death passed in a fog of grief and routine. I threw myself into my work, using the demands of the bench to structure my days and give me purpose when everything else felt hollow. I spent holidays alone for the first time in 30 years. I visited Richard's grave every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers and talking to him about cases I'd handled, updates about my life, all the small things I would have shared during our dinners. In January 2024, 6 months after his death, Mr. Keller called and asked me to come to his office for the formal reading of Richard's will. I'd been expecting this, though I'd been in no hurry to face it. Richard had mentioned years ago that he'd arranged everything to make the process simple for me, that I shouldn't worry about complicated estate matters. I assumed there would be the house, maybe some savings, perhaps a few personal items he wanted distributed to friends. I was completely unprepared for what Mr. Keller revealed that afternoon. The reading took place in a formal conference room with dark wood paneling and leather chairs. Several people I didn't recognize were present, representatives from various charitable organizations. I learned. Mr. Keller sat at the head of the table, Richard's will in front of him, and began by explaining that what he was about to reveal might come as a shock to everyone present, myself most of all. Richard Hale. The man I'd known as my modest, humble father who clipped coupons and drove a 15-year-old sedan had been extraordinarily wealthy. Not comfortable. Not well off. Wealthy beyond anything I could have imagined. Mr. Keller explained that in the early 1980s, Richard had been the silent co-founder of a tech startup, one of the early companies working on computer networking systems that would eventually become foundational to internet infrastructure. He'd provided initial funding and technical expertise, but had deliberately stayed out of the public eye, preferring to work behind the scenes. When the company sold in the late 1990s, Richard's share of the payout had been in the hundreds of millions. He'd taken that money, invested it conservatively but wisely, and watched it grow exponentially over the next 2 decades. His total estate was now valued at over $40 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real. I sat in that leather chair staring at Mr. Keller, unable to process what I was hearing. The colleagues who'd visited Richard's simple 2-bedroom house looked stunned. The neighbors who'd seen him clip coupons and shop at discount stores were speechless. Richard had lived like a middle-class retiree while sitting on generational wealth, and he'd done it all deliberately. Mr. Keller explained that Richard had wanted to give me a normal childhood free from the complications and corruptions that money could bring. He'd wanted me to develop my work ethic, my values, my sense of purpose without the cushion or distraction of wealth. As Mr. Keller read through the will, I learned that Richard had left the bulk of his estate to various charities focused on child welfare and foster care reform. Organizations that provided legal representation for children in custody battles. Programs that supported foster parents. Initiatives that reformed adoption processes and protected vulnerable children. He'd structured the donations to create lasting impact, establishing funds and endowments that would continue his mission long after both of us were gone. But there was one personal bequest, and when Mr. Keller read it aloud, I had to press my hand to my mouth to hold back sobs. To my beloved daughter, Erica Newman, I leave $2,700,000. Not because it represents her worth to me, which is immeasurable, but because it represents her age of 27 when I wrote this document. May she use it to build the life she deserves, knowing that she earned every opportunity through her own merit, her own compassion, and her own strength. She needed nothing from me but love, and I gave it freely. Now I give her this, not as charity, but as celebration of the extraordinary woman she became, despite the cruelty of those who should have cherished her. The specificity of the amount wasn't random or arbitrary. It was a love letter written in numbers, a final message encoded in the bequest itself. 27 years old, the age I'd been when he'd updated his will, when he'd sat down to formalize how he would care for me even after his death. I could barely see through my tears as Mr. Keller continued reading the provisions. The will made no mention of my biological family. Richard had known they'd abandoned me deliberately, and he'd ensured they had no legal claim to anything he left behind. He'd protected me even in death, anticipating needs and threats I hadn't imagined. Because Richard's estate was so substantial, and because the bulk of it was going to charitable causes, the will reading attracted media attention. Local news stations picked up the story as a human interest piece, something heartwarming to offset the usual reports of tragedy and conflict. They ran segments about the reclusive tech millionaire who'd lived like an ordinary citizen, who'd quietly accumulated massive wealth while maintaining his humble lifestyle. The news coverage showed photos of Richard and me together, including one from my law school graduation, where he stood beside me in his simple suit, his face radiating pride. Reporters interviewed legal experts about the unusual structure of the will, particularly the significance of the 27 million figure divided by 10. They framed it as a beautiful story of unconventional family of a man who'd rescued an abandoned child and raised her to become a judge of generosity and love that transcended biology. The story ran on evening news broadcasts across several states. What had been intended as a private moment of grief and transition became public knowledge. Journalists described me as the adopted daughter who'd inherited millions from the father who'd saved her life. They called it a fairy tale ending to a story that began with abandonment. I hated the publicity, but understood it was the price of Richard's generosity becoming public record. I gave one brief statement thanking the media for their interest and asking for privacy as I processed this loss. Then I tried to retreat back into my quiet life, back into my work, back into the grief I was still navigating. I had no idea that hundreds of miles away 2 people were watching that broadcast with very different reactions than the heartwarmed viewers the news stations had hoped for. But 2 people watching the TV froze in shock. I would later learn exactly what happened in that cluttered living room 300 miles away, how a chance television broadcast shattered 30 years of carefully maintained distance and set in motion events that would force me to confront the people I'd spent decades trying to forget. Daniel and Patricia Newman were eating dinner in front of their television, a habit born from years of avoiding meaningful conversation with each other. Their living room told the story of their lives better than any words could. Piles of unopened mail stacked on the coffee table, most of it bills and final notices printed in red ink. A foreclosure warning from the bank taped to the refrigerator. Empty beer cans that Daniel hadn't bothered to throw away. Shopping bags from Patricia's latest compulsive spending spree stuffed in the corner. The local news was playing something they half-watched while eating microwave dinners on mismatched plates. Then a segment began about a local judge who'd inherited millions from her adoptive father, a tech millionaire who'd lived modestly for decades. Patricia was taking a bite of her food when she heard the name Erica Newman. She nearly choked, coughing and reaching for her water glass while Daniel absently patted her back. But then she froze, staring at the television screen. A photograph appeared of a woman in judicial robes, professional and poised with dark eyes that Patricia recognized despite 30 years of separation. "Turn it up," she whispered urgently. Daniel grabbed the remote and increased the volume as the reporter continued. Judge Newman inherited $2.7 million from Richard Hale, the man who adopted her after she was found abandoned in a mall in 1993. The unique bequest represents her age when Hale updated his will, a touching detail in this story of unconventional family and second chances. The year, the location, the circumstances. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. Patricia's hand trembled as she set down her fork. "That's her," she said, her voice flat and strange. "That's our daughter." She didn't say it with wonder or remorse or any of the emotions that should accompany such a realization. She said it with calculation, with the tone of someone identifying a valuable object they'd forgotten they owned. Daniel stared at the screen, at the photo of the accomplished woman who bore no resemblance to the 5-year-old girl he'd last seen through a mall window. They looked at each other, and in that moment of eye contact, an entire conversation happened without words. Not about regret or the desire to reconnect or acknowledgement of the terrible thing they'd done. No, they were thinking the same thing, arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously: opportunity. Their financial situation was beyond dire. It was catastrophic. They owed $47,000 in credit card debt accumulated over years of living beyond their means. They were 3 months behind on mortgage payments, having received multiple warnings that foreclosure proceedings would begin soon. A car repossession notice sat among the mail on their coffee table. And Daniel's gambling debts, the ones to people who didn't send polite reminders or work with payment plans, those were the most pressing of all. They'd exhausted every option. Patricia's sister had refused to lend them more money after they'd failed to repay the last loan. Debt consolidation companies had turned them down. Refinancing was impossible with their credit scores and lack of equity. Bankruptcy loomed as an inevitability, and with it would come the loss of their house and what little stability remained in Sarah's life. Then this broadcast appeared like a twisted answer to prayers they hadn't been righteous enough to speak aloud. Their daughter, the one they'd discarded 30 years ago, was now wealthy. Not just comfortable, but wealthy with millions of dollars they could claim. They didn't see Erica as the child they'd wronged, the little girl they'd deliberately abandoned. They saw her as an asset, something they'd once owned and might own again if they played their cards right. The mental gymnastics happened with remarkable speed. They convinced themselves they had rights. They were her biological parents after all, and didn't blood matter. They'd suffered too in their own way, living with the knowledge of what they'd done, even if they'd never admitted it aloud. Didn't they deserve something for that suffering? And that man, Richard Hale, he'd essentially stolen their daughter, taken advantage of a confused situation. They could frame it that way. They could make people believe it if they told the story correctly. Within 48 hours, they'd contacted Lawrence Preston, a personal injury lawyer whose billboard advertisements promised maximum compensation for your suffering, and whose reputation suggested he'd take almost any case if the potential payout was large enough. They rehearsed their story carefully before the meeting, coordinating details and deciding which version of events would sound most sympathetic. In Preston's office, they presented themselves as heartbroken parents whose daughter had been momentarily separated from them in a crowded mall. They claimed that Richard Hale had taken advantage of a chaotic situation, inserting himself into what should have been a simple family reunification. They insisted they'd searched for Erica for years, but had been blocked by a flawed system that prioritized the adoptive parent over the biological ones. Preston listened with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd heard countless dubious stories and learned not to let skepticism show on his face. He knew the case was weak. The timeline didn't support their narrative, and any competent opposing attorney would shred their story within minutes. But Preston also knew that inheritance disputes were messy, emotional, and often settled quickly to avoid negative publicity. His strategy wouldn't be to win on legal merit. It would be to pressure Erica Newman into settling to make fighting the case more expensive and damaging than simply paying them something to go away. They filed suit 3 weeks after seeing that news broadcast. The complaint claimed wrongful adoption, violation of parental rights, intentional interference with family relationships, and emotional distress. They demanded the entire $2.7 million inheritance plus additional damages for their supposed suffering. It was shameless, legally dubious, and ethically bankrupt. But it was just viable enough to force me into court, to drag me back into contact with the people who'd taught me what abandonment felt like, to threaten everything Richard had tried to protect me from. And soon a knock on Erica's door would deliver their message. I returned home from the courthouse on a cold February evening, my mind occupied with a complicated custody case I'd been overseeing. The work had been emotionally draining, involving a mother fighting to regain custody of children removed due to substance abuse. I'd spent the afternoon weighing evidence, listening to testimonies, trying to determine what would truly serve the children's best interests. It was the kind of case that followed me home, that made me grateful for the quiet of my empty house where I could decompress. But my house wasn't quiet that evening. A man stood on my doorstep, shifting his weight from foot to foot in the cold, clearly waiting for me. He wore a jacket with an official-looking badge, and I recognized him immediately as a process server. I'd seen enough of them in my professional life to know what was coming. "Erica Newman?" he asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. "Yes," I replied, accepting the manila envelope he held out with the professional courtesy that came automatically after years in the legal system. I assumed it was work-related, perhaps something requiring my signature for a case, maybe a subpoena for testimony in a matter involving one of my previous prosecutions. I thanked him, went inside, set down my briefcase, and opened the envelope in my kitchen while still wearing my coat. The document inside was thick, formally bound with a case caption printed across the top. I read the names, and my entire body went cold. Daniel Newman and Patricia Newman versus Erica Newman. I had to sit down. My legs simply wouldn't support me anymore. I lowered myself into the kitchen chair, staring at those names I hadn't seen or heard in 30 years. Names I'd worked diligently to never think about, to relegate to a closed chapter of my life that had no bearing on who I'd become. But there they were, printed in official legal typeface, reaching across 3 decades to drag me back into their orbit. The complaint was 43 pages long. I began reading with hands that trembled despite my best efforts to remain calm and analytical. What I found was a fabricated narrative so brazen in its dishonesty that I felt physically ill. They described themselves as loving parents whose daughter had been momentarily separated from them in a chaotic mall environment. They claimed Richard Hale had taken advantage of the situation, essentially kidnapping me while they frantically searched. They painted themselves as victims of a system that had allowed their daughter to be stolen, and had spent 30 years grieving and searching with no resolution. They were suing for the full inheritance, all $2.7 million, plus additional damages for emotional distress, intentional interference with family relationships, and wrongful adoption. They claimed Richard had obtained me through fraudulent means, that the adoption had never been legitimate, and that I had profited from what amounted to my own kidnapping. It was absurd. It was offensive. And it was devastatingly, terrifyingly real. I sat at that kitchen table as darkness fell outside, reading and rereading the complaint, unable to look away despite how much it hurt. Each paragraph was a new violation, a new lie, a new way of rewriting history to cast themselves as victims rather than perpetrators. They'd taken the worst day of my life and transformed it into a story where they were the ones who suffered. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I was 5 years old again, standing in that toy section, counting to 60, over and over, watching my parents walk away without looking back. The trauma I thought I'd processed through years of therapy, through building a successful life, through the love Richard had given me, all of it came rushing back with unexpected force. I found myself crying for the first time since Richard's funeral, but these tears were different. They weren't the pure grief of loss. They were tears of rage mixed with profound hurt, a combustible combination that left me shaking. How dare they? After 30 years of silence, after never once trying to find me, after letting me believe I was fundamentally unwanted and disposable, now they remembered I existed. Now they wanted me in their lives. No. The distinction was crucial, and I understood it with painful clarity. They didn't want me. They wanted what I'd inherited from the man who'd actually loved me, who'd actually chosen me, who'd actually shown up every single day. They saw me as a means to an end, an asset to be exploited exactly as they'd seen me as a burden to be discarded 30 years ago. I was being abandoned again in a new way. The first time they'd left me physically. This time they were making clear that I'd never been their daughter in any meaningful sense. I was just something they'd created and could now claim ownership of when it became financially convenient. But as the night wore on and shock gave way to clarity, my grief began crystallizing into something else. Resolve. Determination. Cold, focused anger that sharpened rather than clouded my thinking. I was no longer a helpless child. I was a judge, a former prosecutor, someone who'd spent her entire career fighting for justice and protecting the vulnerable. I would not be victimized twice by the same people. By dawn, I knew exactly what I had to do. I called Marcus Chen, a former colleague from my prosecutor days who'd moved into estate litigation and had developed a reputation as someone who didn't lose cases he believed in. We'd maintained a friendship over the years, occasionally meeting for coffee to discuss legal developments and share war stories from our respective fields. "Marcus," I said when he answered, my voice hoarse from crying but steady with purpose. "I need your help. I'm being sued by my biological parents. They want the inheritance Richard left me." There was a brief pause, then Marcus's voice came back firm and clear. "I'll represent you. Pro bono, obviously. This is about principle." "No," I said. "I'm paying you. Full rate. This is about principle, yes, but I need to fight this the right way, the professional way. I need this to be completely above board because they're going to try to twist everything." Marcus agreed, and we set up a meeting for later that week to begin building my defense. The court date was set for August 2024, 6 months away. 6 months to prepare to gather evidence to build an unassailable case that would expose them for exactly what they were. They'd wanted to drag me into court, thinking I was still that frightened child they could discard without consequence. They had no idea what I'd become in the years since they'd thrown me away. They had no idea what they'd just started. The court date was set, and over the next months, Erica would uncover truths that would destroy them. Over the next 4 months, I became an investigator of my own past, systematically gathering evidence that would prove what I'd always known, but never documented. My biological parents had abandoned me deliberately and never once tried to find me. I worked late into the night after finishing my court sessions, turning my dining room into a war room covered with documents, timelines, and records that told the story of my early childhood in painful detail. I started with my school records from 1988 to 1993, requesting them from the elementary school I'd attended before the abandonment. What arrived was more damning than I'd expected. Multiple reports from concerned teachers noted that I frequently arrived at school hungry, wearing clothes that were dirty or inappropriate for the weather. One teacher had documented unexplained bruises on my arms in the spring of 1992. Another had written that I seemed withdrawn and fearful, and had flinched when she'd raised her hand to point at the chalkboard. I pulled my medical records next, using legal channels available to me through my work in the system. The records showed 3 emergency room visits before I turned 5, a broken wrist that my parents claimed happened when I fell off a swing, a concussion from accidentally walking into a door, burns on my hand that they said came from me touching a stove despite being told not to. The doctor's notes included phrases like, "injury inconsistent with stated cause," and "possible non-accidental trauma," the careful language medical professionals use when they suspect abuse but can't prove it definitively. I obtained the original police report from the mall incident in 1993, a document I'd never seen before. It included witness statements that made my stomach turn. The mall employee who'd approached my parents in the parking lot had told police, "I asked if they'd forgotten a child inside. The man waved me off and said no. The woman said, 'No, no one with us.' They didn't seem concerned or confused. They just left." I requested bank records through legal discovery processes demonstrating that Daniel and Patricia Newman had never hired a private investigator, never made payments to any organization related to missing children, never posted rewards or purchased advertising to search for a lost child. There were no expenses consistent with parents desperately trying to find their daughter. Instead, their bank statements showed steady patterns of gambling expenditures, shopping sprees, and routine bills. Every document I uncovered screamed the same truth from different angles. They hadn't lost me. They'd discarded me intentionally, deliberately, with full knowledge of what they were doing. And they'd never looked back, never regretted it, never tried to undo it until the moment I became valuable to them. But while researching their lives through public records and legal databases, I stumbled upon something that stopped me cold. A birth certificate filed in October 1996 in the county where they lived. Sarah Elizabeth Newman, born to Daniel and Patricia Newman. A sister. I had a sister. I had to sit down overwhelmed by this revelation that rewrote my understanding of my own story. They'd had another child 3 years after abandoning me. They'd replaced me, essentially starting over with a new daughter while I grew up with Richard building a life that had nothing to do with them. I dug deeper using resources available through professional databases and public information. Sarah had graduated from the local state college with a degree in elementary education. She worked as a 4th-grade teacher at a public school. She appeared to live a normal, quiet life unmarked by the chaos and neglect that had characterized my early childhood. I found her social media accounts which weren't locked or private. I spent an evening scrolling through years of photos studying the face of the sister I'd never known. She had my eyes the same dark brown that looked almost black in certain lighting. She had my smile slightly crooked on one side. She posted pictures of her classroom, her students' artwork, comments about lesson plans, and parent-teacher conferences. She looked kind, the sort of teacher children would trust and parents would appreciate. There were photos of her with our parents at holidays and birthdays. Sarah hugging Patricia, both of them smiling at the camera. Sarah and Daniel at what looked like a restaurant celebrating something. They looked like a normal family in these images, functional and intact. The photos created a complex knot of emotions in my chest that I couldn't fully untangle. I felt anger that they'd kept one daughter, but not the other, that they'd been capable of raising a child, but had chosen not to raise me. I felt a strange jealousy that Sarah had experienced the family I'd been denied, even as I simultaneously felt grateful that Richard had saved me from a childhood with them. But mostly, I felt protective of this woman I'd never met, this innocent person who had no idea she'd been lied to her entire life. Marcus advised me strongly against contacting Sarah. It could complicate the case, he warned during one of our strategy sessions. If you reach out to her now, their lawyer will claim you're trying to manipulate witnesses or interfere with their family. Wait until after the trial. But I wasn't thinking like a lawyer when I looked at Sarah's photos. I was thinking like the older sister I'd never gotten to be, the protective sibling who wanted to shield her from pain, even as I knew she deserved to know the truth. Sarah had been lied to for 28 years. She'd been raised on a fabricated story about a kidnapped sister, a family tragedy that had never actually happened. She deserved to know the truth, didn't she? Yet telling her would devastate her understanding of everything. Her parents, her childhood, her entire identity as the daughter who remained while the other was stolen. All of it would crumble under the weight of the truth. Was it my place to destroy her world, even if that world was built on lies? I decided to wait until after the case concluded. I didn't want Sarah to feel pressured to choose sides or to become caught in the middle of a legal battle she hadn't asked to be part of. But I saved every photo I found, every piece of information, cataloging it carefully in a folder I labeled simply Sarah. When the time was right after the court case was finished and the truth was legally established, I would reach out to her. Real family, the kind Richard had taught me about, told each other the truth, even when it hurt. Sarah deserved that honesty, deserved to make informed choices about her relationships and her life. But I had no idea that Sarah was already asking dangerous questions. I had no way of knowing that while I was carefully documenting evidence and preparing my case, my sister's world was beginning to fracture. Sarah's awakening to the truth didn't start with me reaching out to her as I'd planned. It started with an accident, an overheard conversation that would set in motion a chain of events neither of us could have predicted. Sarah Newman visited her parents every Sunday for dinner, a routine she'd maintained religiously since graduating college and moving into her own apartment. She was a dutiful daughter, the kind who called regularly and showed up with groceries when she knew money was tight. In late July, she arrived at their house carrying 2 bags of food she'd purchased with her teacher's salary items she knew they needed but wouldn't buy for themselves. As she approached the front door, she heard raised voices from inside. Her parents rarely argued loudly enough for neighbors to hear, so the volume alone made her pause with her hand halfway to the doorbell. Through the window, she could see them in the living room, her father gesturing angrily while her mother tried to shush him. "Once we get that money from her, we can finally stop pretending to give a damn about—" Daniel's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. Patricia cut him off sharply. "Keep your voice down. Sarah will be here soon." Sarah's stomach dropped. She lowered her hand from the doorbell, standing frozen on the porch with grocery bags cutting into her palms. Something in her father's tone and the cruel calculation of those words made her blood run cold. She quietly set the groceries down on the porch and moved carefully around the side of the house where a window stood partially open. What she heard in the next 5 minutes would unravel 28 years of carefully constructed lies. They talked about the lawsuit and that girl we left, and the importance of making sure Sarah never connects us to the old story. They discussed strategy with their lawyer, rehearsing responses to questions they might face in court. Her mother worried aloud about, what happens if Sarah finds out we lied about everything? Sarah backed away from the window, her heart pounding so hard she thought they might hear it. She grabbed the groceries, left them by the door, and walked back to her car on shaking legs. She drove home in a daze, her mind racing to make sense of what she'd heard, while simultaneously refusing to accept the implications. That night, she couldn't sleep. She was a fourth-grade teacher trained to recognize when children were lying or hiding something. She knew the signs: inconsistent stories, defensive reactions to simple questions, nervous behaviors when certain topics arose. She'd used those skills professionally for years, helping identify children who needed intervention or support. Now she turned those same instincts on her own parents, reviewing memories through a new lens. All the time she'd asked about Erica and received vague, rehearsed answers. The way they'd discouraged her from looking into missing children's cases or watching crime documentaries. The absence of any photos of her supposed older sister. The way they'd use Erica's kidnapping to explain every family dysfunction, every financial problem, every moment of emotional distance. The next Sunday, Sarah visited again, this time with questions. "Whatever happened with Erica, my sister, the one who was taken?" she asked carefully over dinner, watching their reactions. Her father's face hardened. "Why are you bringing this up now?" His defensiveness was immediate and disproportionate to the casual question. Her mother launched into the familiar story, but this time Sarah listened with new ears. The details shifted slightly from previous tellings. The mall location changed. The year seemed uncertain. The description of their frantic search remained emotionally charged but factually vague. That night, Sarah began researching online. She typed Erica Newman abandoned 1993 into search engines and found newspaper archives she'd never known existed. Articles about a child found alone in Westfield Mall, the police investigation, the adoption by a local man named Richard Hale. The case had never been classified as a kidnapping. It was abandonment from the start. She found the original police report uploaded by a true crime blogger who'd been interested in the case years ago. The report included witness statements, mall employees describing parents who denied having a child with them, security footage timestamps showing they'd left within minutes, the complete absence of any missing person report filed by Daniel and Patricia Newman. The details didn't just fail to match what she'd been told her entire life. They contradicted it completely, systematically, undeniably. In early August, with the trial just weeks away, Sarah sat in her apartment staring at the phone number she'd found for Judge Erica Newman's chambers. She'd rehearsed what she would say 100 times, but her hand still shook as she dialed. A clerk answered professionally. "Judge Newman's office." Sarah almost hung up. The words caught in her throat, but she forced herself to speak. "I need to leave a message for Judge Newman. It's personal." She took a breath. Tell her Sarah Newman called. Her sister." The clerk's professional tone shifted slightly. "I'll make sure she gets the message. Can I have a number where she can reach you?" Sarah left her cell phone number and hung up immediately, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. What if Erica didn't want to hear from her? What if she blamed Sarah for being the daughter their parents kept? What if her phone rang that evening, an unfamiliar number on the screen? Sarah answered with a trembling voice. "Hello, Sarah." The voice on the other end was cautious, careful. "Is this really you, Erica?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears at hearing her sister's voice for the first time in her conscious memory. The conversation that followed was brief, both of them too overwhelmed for lengthy discussion. Sarah asked the question that had been haunting her since that overheard conversation. Did they really abandon you deliberately? Erica's long silence was more eloquent than any words could have been. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Yes, they did, and I can prove it." Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her, like a building whose foundation had just cracked. "I need to see you," she whispered. "I need to know the truth. All of it." They agreed to meet the next day at a coffee shop halfway between their respective cities. Sarah hung up and sat in her darkening apartment, feeling like a stranger in her own life. Everything she'd believed about her family, Her childhood, her identity was built on lies. And what Sarah learned in that meeting would make her question everything. The coffee shop Sarah had chosen was halfway between our two cities, a deliberate neutral ground that somehow felt appropriate for this meeting neither of us could have imagined a month earlier. I arrived first, sitting in a corner booth where I could watch the entrance, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I wasn't drinking. My stomach was too twisted with nervous anticipation to handle caffeine. When Sarah walked through the door, I knew her immediately. The resemblance hit me like a physical blow. She had my eyes the same dark brown that looked almost black in certain lighting. She had my slight build, my height, even my posture. And as she scanned the coffee shop looking for me, she tucked her hair behind her left ear in a nervous gesture I'd been doing my entire life without realizing it was probably genetic. Our eyes met across the room and Sarah started crying. Not quiet tears, but full sobs that made other patrons turn to look. She walked toward me quickly, and I stood and we embraced awkwardly strangers who should have been family. Two women who shared DNA and trauma but had no shared memories, no foundation of sisterhood to build upon. We sat down and for a moment neither of us could speak. Then Sarah whispered, "You look like me. Or I look like you. I never imagined." "I know," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "I only found out about you a few months ago. I was going to wait until after the trial to reach out, but I'm glad you called first." For the next 2 hours, I told her everything. The mall, the way our mother had looked back at me with cold resolution rather than panic. Richard finding me, taking me home, giving me a life I never would have had otherwise. The cameras that had captured it all. The evidence I'd been gathering that proved our parents never searched, never filed a missing person report, never did anything consistent with actually wanting to find their lost child. I showed her copies of documents on my laptop. The police report with its damning witness statements. The timeline that proved they'd left the building within 4 minutes of abandoning me. The school records documenting suspected neglect, the medical records suggesting abuse. Sarah listened with an expression that cycled through disbelief, horror, anger, and grief. She kept interrupting with, "But they told me," only to trail off as she realized that every story she'd been raised on was a lie. The kidnapping that never happened. The frantic search that never occurred. The grieving parents who were actually just people who'd gotten rid of a burden. My entire childhood was built on fiction. She finally said, her voice hollow. Everything I believed about our family, about myself, about why they were the way they were. It was all a story they made up to avoid taking responsibility for what they did to you. I reached across the table and took her hand. You were a victim too, Sarah. They lied to you. They used you as part of their cover story. You didn't know. But I should have questioned it more, she said, tears streaming down her face. There were so many inconsistencies, so many things that didn't add up. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe I had parents who'd suffered a tragedy rather than parents who were capable of this. Sarah left the coffee shop that day, looking shell-shocked, her entire understanding of her life fundamentally altered. But she also left determined to know the full truth, not just the version I'd presented. She needed to verify it independently, to prove to herself that her parents were really capable of what I'd described. She hired a private investigator using money she'd been saving for a down payment on a house. Over the next 2 weeks, the PI uncovered details that went beyond even what I'd discovered. He interviewed old neighbors who remembered our father's violence, his explosive temper, the sounds of shouting and things breaking that came from our house. He found neighbors who recalled our mother's neglect the way I'd been left alone for hours, the time someone had called Child Protective Services because I'd been locked outside in winter without proper clothing. Most devastatingly, the PI found records of a missing child insurance policy that our father had taken out in 1994, just a year after abandoning me. He'd cashed it in 1995, claiming I was presumed dead and collecting a payout. Bank records showed they'd spent that money on a trip to Las Vegas and new furniture. They'd literally profited from abandoning me, treating my disappearance as a financial opportunity. The PI also documented our father's active gambling addiction casino records, showing consistent losses over the past decade. He found shoplifting charges against our mother from 3 different stores' petty theft to support spending habits they couldn't afford. When Sarah called me with these findings, her voice was different. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by cold clarity. I found things. Terrible things. And I need to know, are you going to fight them in court? Yes, I said. The trial is in 2 weeks. I have a lawyer, Marcus Chen. We're going to present all the evidence, expose everything they've done. Sarah took a shaky breath. I want to testify against them. Sarah, no, I said immediately. You don't have to do that. I don't want you to damage your relationship with your parents because of me. They're not my parents, she cut me off, her voice firm. They're people who lied to me for 28 years. They're people who threw away their daughter and then used her as an excuse for every failing in their lives. You're my sister. You're the one they hurt most, but I've been hurt too. They made me complicit in their lies without my knowledge. I want to stand with you. I felt tears streaming down my face. In 35 years, no one besides Richard had ever chosen me over the easier option. Are you sure? I asked. I'm sure, Sarah said. Besides, someone needs to protect you. That's what big sisters do, right? I laughed through my tears. I'm the older sister. I'm 35. You're 28. Then I guess we protect each other, Sarah said softly. We spent the next week preparing her testimony with Marcus, who was both shocked and impressed that she'd come forward. He helped her understand what to expect on the stand, how to stay calm under cross-examination, how to present her evidence clearly and credibly. Sarah's decision to testify changed everything about the trial. It was no longer just about evidence and documents. It was about their own daughter standing up to say that their story was a lie, that she'd lived with them and learned the truth, that she was choosing justice over loyalty to people who'd never deserved it. 2 weeks later, Erica walked into court with a secret weapon no one expected. August 15, 2024. The date had been marked on my calendar for 6 months, circled in red ink like a warning or a promise. I arrived at the courthouse with Marcus, both of us dressed professionally, carrying briefcases full of evidence that would dismantle every lie my biological parents had constructed. The morning was warm, almost oppressively so, and I could feel sweat gathering under my collar despite my best efforts to remain composed. We walked through the courthouse entrance, through security, down the familiar hallways I'd traversed countless times in my professional capacity. But this time was different. This time I wasn't here as a judge or a prosecutor. I was here as a defendant, forced to defend my inheritance and my entire life story against people who'd forfeited any right to either decades ago. As we approached the courtroom, I saw them. Daniel and Patricia Newman stood near the entrance with their attorney, and seeing them for the first time in 30 years felt surreal. They were older, grayer, diminished by time in ways that made them seem smaller than the giants they'd been in my childhood memories. Patricia wore an ill-fitting black dress that was clearly meant to convey mourning, though it hung awkwardly on her frame and looked like something purchased at a discount store specifically for this occasion. Daniel looked uncomfortable in a cheap suit that pulled across his shoulders, his tie knotted too tightly. But what struck me most wasn't their appearance. It was their expressions. There was no shame in their faces, no visible remorse or uncertainty. Instead, they looked at me with pure calculation, assessing me the way someone might appraise property at an auction, determining value and potential profit. Patricia whispered something to Daniel, her eyes never leaving me. He nodded, and a slight smirk crossed his face. They weren't here as parents seeking reconciliation or hoping to rebuild a relationship with a daughter they'd lost. They were here as plaintiffs seeking payment, viewing me as a financial asset they'd once owned and might own again if they played their cards correctly. The realization settled over me with cold clarity, eliminating any remaining doubt I might have harbored about showing them mercy or giving them the benefit of any doubt. They didn't deserve it. They'd never deserved it. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and walked past them without acknowledgement, treating them exactly as they'd treated me 30 years ago, as strangers unworthy of recognition. We entered the courtroom, and I took my seat at the defendant's table beside Marcus. The room filled slowly with spectators, including several journalists who'd been following the story since it first made news. Sarah sat in the gallery, her presence both comforting and nerve-wracking. She'd chosen to come despite knowing she'd testify later, wanting to show her support from the beginning. Judge Anderson entered, and we all rose. She was an older Black woman with kind eyes and a reputation for absolute fairness. I'd appeared before her once during my time as a prosecutor, and she'd impressed me with her ability to be both compassionate and uncompromising. I felt grateful she'd been assigned to this case. Lawrence Preston, my parents' attorney, stood to deliver his opening statement. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and a practiced courtroom presence. What he delivered was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, a narrative that would have been compelling if it weren't built entirely on fabrications. He painted Daniel and Patricia as heartbroken parents who'd suffered every parent's worst nightmare. He described their daughter vanishing in a crowded mall, the frantic search that never actually occurred, the decades of anguish they'd supposedly endured. He suggested that Richard Hale had taken advantage of a tragic situation, essentially kidnapping me, while they desperately searched, later adopting me through a system that had failed to verify parental consent properly. The inheritance that Ms. Newman received, Preston argued, his voice trembling with practiced emotion, was built on a fraudulent foundation. My clients never gave consent for their daughter to be adopted. They never stopped searching for her. They never stopped loving her. And now, after decades of suffering, after years of wondering if their daughter was alive or dead, they discover she's not only alive, but has inherited millions from the man who took her from them. My clients don't seek this compensation out of greed. They seek it as restitution for the profound loss and suffering they've endured because the system failed them. It was a performance theatrical and emotionally charged, and I could see it affecting some of the spectators in the gallery. Preston was good at his job, even if that job involved defending the indefensible. But then he made a critical error. He turned toward me to gesture during his argument, using me as a visual reference for his point about the stolen daughter. As he did, his eyes caught the nameplate in front of Marcus that read, "Representing Erica Newman." His gaze moved to the placard at our table that identified me formally, and I watched the color drain from his face. He froze mid-sentence, mid-gesture, his mouth still open from the word he'd been speaking. He glanced down at his notes frantically, then back at me, then at Judge Anderson. His confidence evaporated visibly, replaced by something that looked like panic. "Your Honor," he said, his voice no longer smooth but wavering and uncertain. May I approach the bench?" Judge Anderson nodded, gesturing him forward. Marcus glanced at me with a slight smile, understanding what was happening even if I didn't yet. Preston approached the bench and began whispering urgently. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see Judge Anderson's expression shift from neutral attention to something that might have been respect. She glanced at me, her eyes thoughtful, then nodded at whatever Preston had said. He returned to his table looking distinctly unsettled, and Judge Anderson addressed the courtroom. "For the record," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "the court acknowledges that the defendant, Erica Newman, currently serves as a magistrate judge in this district. Let that be noted in the transcript." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Daniel and Patricia looked confused, glancing at each other, and then at their lawyer with questions in their eyes. Preston looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The journalists in the gallery immediately began taking notes, recognizing that this detail changed the entire narrative of the case. And what Judge Anderson said next sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The whispers that had erupted after Judge Anderson's announcement continued for several moments, creating a buzz of speculation and surprise throughout the gallery. I kept my expression neutral, professional, even as I felt a strange mixture of exposure and vindication. My position as a magistrate judge was public record, but having it announced in this context changed the dynamics of the entire proceeding in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Judge Anderson allowed the reaction to settle naturally, then raised her hand for silence. When the courtroom quieted, she leaned forward slightly, her expression serious and measured. Before we proceed further, she began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd presided over thousands of cases and understood the gravity of each one. I want to ensure all parties understand what we're undertaking here. This court operates on evidence, not emotion. I see that this case involves complex family dynamics, and I recognize that Judge Newman holds a position within our judicial system. She paused, letting her words settle, then looked directly at Preston. Her gaze was steady, professional, but I could see something in her eyes that might have been a warning, or perhaps an offering of mercy. Mr. Preston, I'm required to inform you that your clients have the right to withdraw their complaint at any time before we proceed to testimony. Once we begin examining evidence, once witnesses take the stand and are sworn in, this case will move forward to its conclusion. There will be no stopping mid-trial because one party decides they don't like how things are proceeding. Her meaning was clear to anyone with legal training, though she phrased it carefully enough to avoid appearing prejudicial. She was essentially telling Preston, you're about to fight a legal professional on her own ground in a courtroom that values evidence over narrative. If your case is weak, if you're relying on emotional manipulation rather than facts, now is your last chance to walk away before you're destroyed. I watched Preston's face as he absorbed this warning. He glanced at his clients, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the rapid calculation of risk versus reward. This was his moment to advise Daniel and Patricia to cut their losses, to withdraw the complaint, and avoid the public humiliation that would inevitably follow. Preston leaned over to whisper to them. I couldn't hear what he said, but I could see Patricia's face harden with stubborn determination. Daniel shook his head firmly. Patricia whispered back, her expression defiant, and I heard fragments, "Our rights," and "She owes us." Thus they were driven by greed stronger than wisdom, by a conviction that blood relationship entitled them to something they'd never earned. They couldn't see or refuse to acknowledge that they were about to be eviscerated by the truth. Preston straightened, his expression resigned, and addressed the court. We proceed, Your Honor. His voice carried less confidence than it had during his opening statement. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. The spectators, about 30 people, including several journalists who'd been covering this unusual inheritance dispute, adjusted in their seats and leaned forward with renewed interest. Everyone recognized that the stakes had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just a family drama anymore, not just an inheritance dispute between estranged relatives. This was a legal professional defending herself against accusations that, if somehow proven true, would destroy her career and reputation. This was a magistrate judge being forced to prove that her entire life story was legitimate, that she'd been genuinely abandoned rather than kidnapped, that the man who raised her had acted righteously rather than criminally. My biological parents seemed oblivious to how much had shifted. Patricia leaned toward Daniel and whispered loud enough that I could hear from my table. Why does it matter what job she has? We're her parents. That's what matters. But Preston understood perfectly. I watched him loosen his collar slightly, reach for his water glass with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, and shuffle through his notes with the air of a man preparing for a battle. He was suddenly far less confident about winning. His entire strategy had been based on pressuring me to settle on making the fight more expensive and emotionally costly than simply paying them something to go away. That strategy had just evaporated. Now he would have to actually prove his case, and from the look on his face, he was realizing how thin his evidence actually was. Judge Anderson turned to our table. Mr. Chen, your opening statement. Marcus stood, and I felt a surge of gratitude for his presence. He'd been preparing for this moment as carefully as I had, understanding that the opening statement would set the tone for everything that followed. His approach was completely different from Preston's theatrical performance. Marcus didn't appeal to emotion or paint dramatic pictures. He didn't raise his voice or use sweeping gestures. Instead, he spoke with surgical precision, each word chosen for maximum impact. Your Honor, the plaintiffs claim they searched for their daughter for 30 years. We will present evidence showing they didn't search for 30 minutes. They claim they loved her. We will present evidence of neglect and intentional abandonment documented by teachers, medical professionals, and law enforcement. They claim Mr. Hale's adoption was fraudulent, that he somehow stole their daughter. We will present documentation showing it was the most legitimate righteous act in this entire story, a man saving a child who'd been thrown away like garbage. Marcus paused, letting those words hang in the air, letting the starkness of the truth contrast with Preston's polished lies. Then he continued, his voice steady and unwavering. This case isn't really about inheritance law or adoption procedures. It's about two people who deliberately abandoned their 5-year-old daughter in a shopping mall, walked away without looking back, and then built 30 years of lies to avoid taking responsibility for their cruelty. Now, having discovered that the child they discarded grew up to become successful. Despite them, they want to profit from the extraordinary life she built without their help, without their love, without anything from them except trauma. He turned slightly, gesturing not dramatically but simply toward the evidence boxes stacked at our table. We have security footage. We have witness statements. We have medical records, school records, police reports, and bank records. We have documentation of every lie they've told and every truth they've tried to hide. The evidence will speak for itself, Your Honor, and it will be loud. Marcus sat down. No theatrical flourishes, no emotional appeals. Just devastating clarity and the promise of undeniable proof. The contrast with Preston's opening couldn't have been more stark. I glanced at the gallery and caught Sarah's eye. She nodded at me, her expression a mixture of support and barely contained anger toward the people who'd lied to both of us. She was ready to testify, ready to stand up and tell the truth regardless of the cost. Judge Anderson made a note on her pad, then looked up at Marcus. "Proceed with your first witness, Mr. Chen." Marcus stood again, and his next words would change everything. And then Marcus played the tape that silenced the room. Marcus walked to the front of the courtroom where a large screen had been set up specifically for this presentation. He held a remote control in one hand and a thin folder in the other, moving with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly how devastating his evidence would be. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present video evidence obtained from Westfield Mall security archives," Marcus said. "This footage has been preserved and authenticated by the mall's security company and has been verified by independent forensic video analysts as unedited and accurate." Judge Anderson nodded. "Proceed." The lights dimmed slightly and the screen illuminated with grainy but clear security footage. In the upper right corner, a timestamp read, November 6, 1993, 2:47 p.m. The angle showed the interior of a department store's toy section, the camera positioned high enough to capture a wide view of the area. I watched myself at 5 years old appear on screen, and my breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen this footage since Marcus first showed it to me during our preparation. Watching it again in this public setting with my biological parents sitting just feet away felt surreal and painful. The small girl on screen wore a faded purple coat with a broken zipper clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. Patricia led her into the toy section, bent down to say something I couldn't hear, and the little girl nodded eagerly. Then Patricia stood and walked away, her stride steady and purposeful, never looking back. The camera angle switched to the parking lot exterior. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as Daniel and Patricia Newman walked toward their car. There was no frantic searching, no looking around desperately, no behavior consistent with parents who'd lost track of their child. They walked with steady, purposeful steps, like people leaving a store after completing their shopping. A mall employee intercepted them near their vehicle. Even without audio, the interaction was clear. The employee was asking them something, gesturing back toward the building. Daniel waved dismissively, an annoyed flick of his hand. Both parents shook their heads firmly. They climbed into their sedan, closed the doors, and within moments the car was pulling out of the parking space. Marcus paused the video. The timestamp showed 2:51 p.m. In the frozen frame, their car was halfway to the parking lot exit. In the background, through the mall's glass windows, the tiny figure of a little girl was barely visible, still standing in the toy section where she'd been left. 4 minutes, Marcus said quietly, letting the words land with their full weight. From the moment they left their daughter inside to the moment they drove off the property, exactly 4 minutes. Not 4 hours of searching. Not even 4 minutes of hesitation. 4 minutes to abandon a 5-year-old child and leave. I could hear crying in the gallery behind me. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look at Daniel and Patricia, though I could feel their presence like a weight pressing against the side of my awareness. But Marcus wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we also have audio enhancement of this footage. A forensic audio specialist has isolated and amplified the conversation that occurred in the parking lot." He played the segment again, this time with enhanced audio. The footage remained the same, but now we could hear voices over the background noise of traffic and other shoppers. The employee's voice came through clearly. "Excuse me, ma'am, did you have a little girl with you? There's a child in the toy section asking for her mother." Patricia's voice cut in clear and cold, with no trace of confusion or concern. "No, no one with us. We're alone." The employee persisted. "Are you sure she matches the description?" Daniel's voice now irritated. "We said no. We don't have a kid with us." Then, as they walked away from the employee toward their car, Patricia's voice again quieter but still audible after the forensic enhancement. "Finally, let's go before she starts crying where someone can hear." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shocked whispers, even a few strangled sobs from spectators. Judge Anderson banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but it took several moments for the room to quiet. I kept my eyes on the screen, watching that frozen image of the car driving away. I didn't trust myself to look at anything else, afraid that if I turned toward my biological parents, I might lose the professional composure I'd maintained so carefully. Patricia sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, her face completely white, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone pale. Daniel stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. He refused to look at the screen, refused to acknowledge the image of himself and his wife, walking away from their daughter without a backward glance. Preston closed his eyes briefly, and I saw him take a deep breath. He knew in that moment that his case had just collapsed. Whatever slim hope he'd had of winning or even negotiating a settlement had evaporated. The evidence was too clear, too damning, too impossible to explain away or reframe. Judge Anderson restored order and nodded at Marcus to continue. "The defense calls James Whitmore to the stand," Marcus announced. An older man stood from the gallery, and I recognized him immediately. James Whitmore, the security guard who'd been on duty that day, who'd sat with me in the security office and tried to make a frightened 5-year-old feel safe while they figured out what to do with me. He was 70 now, his hair completely white, his shoulders slightly stooped with age, but his eyes were still sharp and kind. He walked to the witness stand with steady steps, was sworn in, and took his seat. Marcus approached him gently. "Mr. Whitmore, can you tell the court your position on November 6, 1993? "I was head of security at Westfield Mall," James said, his voice clear and strong despite his age. "I'd been in that position for 15 years at that point." "And do you remember the incident involving the child in the toy section?" "I remember it like it was yesterday," James said, looking directly at me with an expression of warmth and sadness. "I've thought about that little girl for 31 years, wondering what happened to her." Marcus walked him through the events of that day, and James testified with detailed clarity. He described finding me standing in the same spot for over an hour, never wandering, never crying out, just waiting with the patience of a child who'd been told to stay put and believed that obedience would be rewarded. "I've worked security for 30 years, James said. "I know the difference between a lost child and an abandoned one. A lost child panics, cries, moves around looking for their parents. That little girl just waited. She was waiting for someone she believed would come back. The parents left knowing they wouldn't." He turned in his seat to look directly at Daniel and Patricia, his expression filled with contempt. "I reviewed that footage with police that night. I saw you walk away without looking back. I saw you deny knowing her when asked. I've carried guilt for 30 years, wondering if I should have done more, if I could have prevented whatever trauma she endured. But looking at her now, seeing the woman she became, I realize she was saved from you. She's survived and thrived, and it's despite you, not because of you. Objection. Preston rose quickly. The witness is offering opinion and speculation, not factual testimony. Sustained, Judge Anderson said. Mr. Whitmore, please limit your testimony to factual observations. But the damage, as Preston well knew, was already done. The truth was now unignorable, presented through video, audio, and human testimony that converged into a single devastating narrative. But Marcus had saved the most devastating evidence for last. After James Whitmore stepped down from the witness stand, Marcus returned to our table and retrieved a laptop and a small external hard drive. I knew what was coming next. We'd discussed this moment extensively during our preparation. And I'd watched the video multiple times in Marcus's office, each viewing leaving me emotionally devastated and simultaneously filled with gratitude for Richard's foresight. But watching it in private and watching it in a courtroom filled with strangers and the people who'd abandoned me were entirely different experiences. I braced myself as Marcus addressed the court. Your Honor, the defense would like to present a video recorded by Richard Hale approximately 6 months before his death. This recording was made in the presence of his attorney, Mr. Keller, who verified Mr. Hale's mental capacity at the time and can testify to the authenticity of this document if needed. Preston rose immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. The declarant is not available for cross-examination. Judge Anderson considered this briefly. Mr. Chen, your response. Your Honor, this is a statement by the declarant about his own actions, intentions, and state of mind recorded while he had full legal capacity and in the presence of a witness. Under the federal rules of evidence, specifically the state of mind exception to hearsay, this testimony is admissible. Mr. Hale is explaining why he took certain actions and what he observed, not offering testimony about the truth of matters asserted by others. Judge Anderson nodded. Objection overruled. The video may be presented. The courtroom lights dimmed and the large screen illuminated once more. This time, instead of grainy security footage, we saw Richard sitting in his study at home. I recognized the room immediately, the built-in bookshelves behind him, the desk where he'd helped me with homework, countless nights the window that looked out onto the small garden he'd tended. But Richard himself looked diminished by illness. He was thinner than I remembered, his face gaunt, his hair grayer and sparser. Yet his eyes remained clear and purposeful, focused on the camera with the same gentle intensity I'd known my entire life with him. My name is Richard Hale. He began, his voice slightly weakened but steady. I'm recording this on August 3, 2023, with my attorney Thomas Keller present as witness. If you're watching this, it means I've passed away and someone has challenged Erica's inheritance. I predicted this would happen. Let me tell you why I was right to be concerned. I felt tears already gathering, but I forced myself to keep watching, to be present for this final gift Richard had left me. I adopted Erica legally and completely with full documentation after she was abandoned at age 5 in Westfield Mall. The adoption process took nearly 2 years to finalize, involving home studies, background checks, and court proceedings. Everything was done properly, transparently, and with the approval of the state. But I always knew that someday her biological parents might return, not out of love or genuine desire for reconciliation, but out of opportunity. Richard paused, and I could see him gathering strength to continue. So I took precautions that Erica never knew about. I hired a private investigator, a man named Robert Chen, to monitor Daniel and Patricia Newman periodically over the next 30 years. Not constantly, but checking in every few years to document their lives and their actions regarding Erica. He reached off camera and pulled several documents into view, holding them up so the camera could capture them clearly. What Robert found was exactly what I feared. They never searched for Erica. They never filed missing person reports beyond the initial police incident. They never contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They never appeared on television appeals or organized community searches. Their search for their daughter existed only in the stories they told their neighbors and friends. Richard's expression hardened slightly. But it gets worse. In 1994, Daniel Newman took out a life insurance policy on Erica, claiming her as his dependent, despite having no contact with her and no legal custody. In 1995, he filed a claim on that policy, stating that Erica should be presumed dead after 2 years missing. He collected a payout of $75,000. He held up bank records pointing to specific transactions. These are the bank statements showing what they did with that money. They took a 10-day trip to Las Vegas. They purchased new furniture. They paid off credit card debt accumulated from gambling and shopping. They didn't use a single dollar to search for their supposedly missing daughter. They profited from her abandonment. The courtroom was completely silent. I could hear nothing but Richard's voice and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't tell Erica about this monitoring because I wanted her to heal without the burden of knowing she was still connected to them in any way. I wanted her to feel free to build her life without looking over her shoulder. But I kept all this evidence for exactly this moment, for exactly this scenario. I knew that if I left her money, if she became successful, they might come back. Not as parents seeking to rebuild a relationship, but as opportunists seeking to profit from the life she built entirely without them. Richard set down the documents and looked directly into the camera, and for a moment it felt like he was looking directly at me, speaking to me across the barrier of death. These people didn't lose a daughter, he said, his voice firm despite his illness. They discarded one. They threw her away deliberately, and they did it without remorse. They've lived 30 years building lies to avoid taking responsibility for their cruelty. Now they want to profit from her success to claim ownership of achievements they had no part in creating. Don't let them. His expression softened then, and what came next broke me completely. My daughter, he said, and his voice carried such tenderness that I could barely breathe. If you're watching this, I want you to know something. I didn't choose you because I felt sorry for you. I didn't take you in out of pity or obligation or because I thought you were some charity case. I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying to hold back sobs. I chose you because from the moment I saw you waiting so bravely in that mall, standing in that toy section with your stuffed rabbit counting patiently. Even though you must have been terrified, I saw strength and worthiness. I saw a child who deserved so much more than she'd been given. You were never unwanted, Erica. You were always deserving of more than they could give. You were always enough. Tears streamed down my face, and I stopped trying to hide them. I've watched you grow from a frightened 5-year-old into a woman of justice and compassion. I've watched you take your pain and transform it into purpose. Every day with you has been a gift I never expected to receive. The money I left you is nothing compared to what you've given me: purpose. Joy, family. You gave me the privilege of being your father, and that's worth more than any amount of money. Richard leaned forward slightly, his eyes intense. Don't let these people make you doubt your worth for even a moment. Don't let them rewrite history or make you question whether you deserved to be loved. You were always enough. You were always loved. You were always my daughter, and you always will be. The screen went black. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment, broken only by the sounds of crying from various locations in the gallery. I wiped my tears with shaking hands, and Marcus quietly handed me tissues. I glanced back and saw Sarah openly weeping along with several of the journalists and spectators. Even Judge Anderson's eyes were bright with moisture, though she maintained her professional composure. Daniel and Patricia sat frozen at their table, their faces unreadable masks. Preston looked defeated, staring down at his notes as if they might somehow contain an answer to what he'd just witnessed. Judge Anderson cleared her throat. We'll take a 15-minute recess. She stood, and we all rose as she left the bench. The evidence was undeniable, comprehensive, devastating. But the defense had one more witness no one saw coming. After the 15-minute recess during which I'd composed myself in the courthouse bathroom and Marcus had reviewed our remaining witnesses, we reconvened. The emotional weight of Richard's video still hung in the air, but Marcus was ready to pivot from sentiment to cold, hard evidence of financial motivation. "The defense calls Dr. Helen Rodriguez," Marcus announced. A woman in her 50s walked to the stand carrying a tablet and a thick folder. She wore a business suit and glasses projecting exactly the image of clinical professionalism that Marcus wanted. Dr. Rodriguez was sworn in and took her seat, placing her materials on the small shelf in front of her. Marcus approached. "Dr. Rodriguez, please state your credentials for the court." "I'm a forensic accountant with 22 years of experience. I hold a doctorate in accounting from Stanford University and am certified in financial forensics. I've testified as an expert witness in over 100 cases involving financial fraud, embezzlement, and economic damages." "And have you examined the financial records of Daniel and Patricia Newman?" "I have, extensively." Marcus nodded. "Please walk the court through your findings." Dr. Rodriguez opened her tablet and her findings appeared on the courtroom screen. She spoke with clinical precision, her tone neutral and factual, which somehow made the information more damning than any emotional delivery could have been. Over the past decade, Mr. and Mrs. Newman have accumulated $63,000 in credit card debt across 7 different cards, all currently in delinquent status. They've taken out multiple payday loans, the kind with interest rates exceeding 300% annually. They've refinanced their home 3 times since 2015, pulling equity out each time to pay off previous debts. The home is now worth approximately $140,000, but they owe $210,000 against it, meaning they're severely underwater. She pulled up bank records. They've had 2 vehicles repossessed in the past 5 years. Their credit scores are both below 500, which places them in the poor category. They've had multiple accounts sent to collections, and there are currently 3 judgments against them for unpaid debts totaling over $30,000. Dr. Rodriguez looked up from her tablet. "But perhaps most significantly, I found evidence of Mr. Newman's gambling addiction. Casino records from 3 establishments show cumulative losses of approximately $40,000 over the past 5 years. These aren't occasional recreational visits. These are consistent, habitual patterns of gambling behavior that coincide with the family's financial deterioration." She presented a timeline. "They've been in continuous financial crisis since at least 2015, but the situation became acute in late 2023 and early 2024. They received a foreclosure notice in December 2023. They were 3 months behind on mortgage payments as of January 2024. Then she displayed another piece of evidence that made the connection unmistakable. On January 17, 2024, the local news broadcast a story about Judge Erica Newman's inheritance. On January 28, 2024, exactly 11 days later, the Newmans filed this lawsuit. Dr. Rodriguez looked directly at Judge Anderson. "In my professional opinion, based on 22 years analyzing financial motivations, the timing indicates opportunistic behavior rather than genuine parental concern. If their primary motivation was reconnecting with their daughter, one would expect them to have made attempts prior to learning about her financial windfall. The fact that they initiated legal action within 11 days of learning about the inheritance while facing imminent foreclosure suggests financial desperation was the driving factor." She closed her tablet. "They didn't search for their daughter for 30 years. They searched for her 11 days after learning she had money." The courtroom absorbed this in heavy silence. Preston stood for cross-examination, but seemed to struggle with where to begin. He asked a few technical questions about Dr. Rodriguez's methodology, which she answered with unshakable professionalism, and then he sat down, unable to dispute the fundamental timeline she'd established. But Marcus wasn't finished exposing their true motivations. "Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce email correspondence obtained through legal discovery." He projected the emails on the screen, and I watched my biological parents' greed laid bare in their own words. The first email was from Patricia to Preston, dated February 3, 2024. "Mr. Preston, I want to be clear about our priorities. We don't care about having a relationship with her. We need this money. Our house is in foreclosure and we have creditors calling constantly. Tell her we'll go to the press if she doesn't settle. Make her understand that fighting this will damage her reputation as a judge. She'll settle to avoid the scandal. Get us as much as you can." The second email was from Daniel, sent the same day. "How much can we squeeze out of her? The $2.7 million sounds good, but is that really all she got? Can we sue for more? What about emotional damages for all these years? Mental anguish? We should be asking for at least $5 million. She's a judge, she can afford it." These weren't the words of grieving parents hoping to reconnect with their long-lost daughter. These were the words of extortionists, of people who saw a vulnerable target and calculated how much pain they could inflict to extract maximum payment. Preston's face turned red as his own communications with his clients destroyed what little remained of their case. He stood stammering, "Your Honor, these are privileged communications." "Between you and your clients, yes," Marcus interrupted smoothly. "But these particular emails were copied to a third party, their financial advisor, which waives privilege. We obtained them legally through proper discovery channels and opposing counsel was notified." Judge Anderson examined the authentication documents. "The emails are admissible. Continue, Mr. Chen." Preston had no questions for cross-examination. What could he possibly ask that would undo the damage of his own clients condemning themselves in writing? Marcus then called a series of character witnesses, former neighbors who'd lived near the Newmans in the early 1990s. The first two described a chaotic household marked by shouting neglect and instability. But it was the third witness, an elderly woman named Grace Chen, who delivered testimony that left the courtroom completely transfixed. Mrs. Chen was 78 years old, a tiny woman with white hair and kind eyes magnified by thick glasses. She moved slowly to the witness stand, was sworn in, and sat down with the careful movements of someone whose body no longer cooperated as readily as it once had. Marcus approached her gently. "Mrs. Chen, did you know the Newman family in the early 1990s? I lived next door to them from 1988 until 1995, she said, her voice soft but clear. "I knew them, yes. And I knew their little girl. Can you describe what you observed?" Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "That poor child. I called child services twice because I'd see her outside in winter without a proper coat. Sometimes she'd be in the yard for hours alone in weather that wasn't safe for a child. Her parents would be inside and you could hear them fighting, throwing things. I'd invite her over sometimes, give her cookies and hot chocolate, and she was always so grateful, like nobody showed her kindness at home." She paused, composing herself. "When she disappeared, when Patricia told everyone she'd been kidnapped from the mall, I wanted to believe it. I really did. But something didn't sit right with me. I saw Patricia's face when she told the story to neighbors. She looked relieved, not devastated, not frantically worried. Relieved, like she'd solved a problem rather than lost a child." Mrs. Chen looked directly at Patricia, who wouldn't meet her eyes. "It haunted me for years, that look on your face. I told myself I must have been wrong, that grief affects people differently. But I always wondered. And now seeing all this, knowing the truth, I'm just glad that little girl survived you. I'm glad she found someone who actually loved her." The courtroom remained silent as Mrs. Chen stepped down. These weren't lawyers or expert witnesses. These were ordinary people who'd witnessed neglect and abandonment firsthand, who'd tried to help a vulnerable child who'd carried questions and guilt for 30 years. The evidence was comprehensive, undeniable, devastating. Richard's video, the financial records, the emails, the witness testimony, all of it converged into a single, inescapable truth. Daniel and Patricia Newman had deliberately abandoned their daughter and were now trying to profit from the life she'd built without them. But nothing could prepare the courtroom for what happened when Sarah took the stand. After Mrs. Chen's testimony, after the financial records had been laid bare, and the emails had exposed their true motivations, I thought Marcus had presented everything. I knew Sarah had agreed to testify, but I'd assumed she would be called earlier in the proceedings. I hadn't realized Marcus had been saving her for this exact moment for maximum impact, after all the other evidence had already painted an undeniable picture. Marcus stood, and his next words sent a jolt through the courtroom. "The defense calls Sarah Newman to the stand." The reaction was immediate and electric. Spectators gasped and turned to look at the gallery. Preston shot to his feet, his face flushed with confusion and anger. "Objection! Your Honor, this witness was never disclosed in discovery. We had no notice." Marcus remained calm, his voice steady. "Ms. Newman only came forward 3 days ago, Your Honor. The moment she contacted us and agreed to testify, we filed emergency notice with both the court and opposing counsel. All proper procedures were followed given the extraordinary circumstances." Judge Anderson looked at Preston. "Did you receive the notice, Mr. Preston?" Preston fumbled with his papers. "Yes, but 3 days is insufficient time to prepare for. The rules allow for late witness disclosure under exceptional circumstances," Judge Anderson said. "The witness may testify. You'll have full opportunity for cross-examination." Sarah stood from her seat in the gallery. Every eye in the courtroom followed her as she walked toward the witness stand. She moved with quiet determination, her shoulders straight, though I could see her hands trembling slightly. As she passed the plaintiff's table, Daniel hissed at her, his voice loud enough for the front rows to hear, "What the hell are you doing?" Patricia looked like she might physically collapse, her face draining of all color, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Preston leaned toward them, whispering urgently, trying to understand what was happening, but Sarah didn't pause or acknowledge them. She simply continued walking. She reached the witness stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. As she sat down, she finally looked at our biological parents, her expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. Then she turned her attention to Marcus, waiting for his questions. Marcus approached gently, his demeanor respectful and calm. "Ms. Newman, can you explain your relationship to the plaintiffs?" Sarah's voice was steady, clearer than I'd expected given the circumstances. "Daniel and Patricia Newman are my biological parents. Erica Newman is my sister, my half-sister technically, though I consider her fully my sister. She's the one they told me was kidnapped from a mall when I was a baby." "And how long have you believed this story?" "My entire life, 28 years. They told me about Erica before I could even fully understand what they were saying. It was always part of our family narrative, the missing sister, the tragedy that defined us." Marcus nodded. "Can you describe how this supposed tragedy affected your childhood?" Sarah took a breath, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of confusion and pain finally being articulated. "They used Erica's disappearance to explain everything. Why we didn't have much money because they'd spent so much searching for her. Why they seemed distant sometimes because their hearts were broken. Why they couldn't fully engage with me because part of them was always with the daughter they'd lost." Her voice cracked slightly, but she continued. "My mother told me once that she couldn't love me as fully as she wanted to because her heart was broken over Erica. She said it like it was something I should understand and accept. I spent 28 years feeling guilty for being the daughter who remained. I wondered constantly if they wished I'd been the one taken instead. I shaped my entire life around their supposed grief, trying to be good enough, successful enough, present enough, to somehow make up for the sister they'd lost." I felt tears streaming down my face as I listened to Sarah describe a childhood as damaged by our parents' lies as mine had been by their direct cruelty. We'd both been victims, just in different ways. "When did you first question this narrative?" Marcus asked. "In late July of this year. I overheard them talking about a lawsuit about getting money from her, about making sure I never connected them to the old story. I didn't understand at first, but I started paying attention, asking questions. Their answers didn't match what they'd told me before. Details changed. They became defensive when I asked for specifics about their search efforts." "What did you do then?" "I hired a private investigator. I needed to know the truth independently. What he found..." Sarah paused, composing herself. He found that they never searched. He found the insurance policy my father took out and cashed in, claiming Erica was presumed dead. He found bank records showing they spent that money on a vacation and furniture. He found neighbors who remembered neglect and abuse. He found that everything they'd told me was a lie. Marcus let that sit for a moment before asking his next question. Did you confront your parents with this information? Yes. I asked my mother directly if they'd really searched for Erica the way they'd always claimed. She said, of course we did. But when I asked for details, which police departments, which investigators, any documentation, she became angry. She told me to stop asking questions, that I was being disrespectful, that I was betraying the family by doubting them. That's when I knew for certain. They weren't victims. They were liars. And I'd been one more person they'd lied to. Marcus walked to our table and picked up a document. Ms. Newman, I'm showing you an email your mother sent to their attorney. Have you seen this before? Sarah looked at the document and I saw her jaw tighten. Yes, it says they don't care about having a relationship with Erica. They just need the money. In your opinion, based on everything you've learned, did your parents abandon your sister intentionally? Sarah looked directly at Daniel and Patricia. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice remained unwavering, strong, certain. Yes. They threw her away like she was nothing. Like she was a burden they wanted to be rid of. And then they built their entire life on that lie, using her as an excuse for every failing, every bad decision, every moment of emotional unavailability. They didn't search for her. They erased her. They pretended she'd been taken when they were the ones who left her. And now they want to profit from her success, from the life she built entirely without them, despite them. She turned to Judge Anderson. I'm testifying today because my sister deserves someone in this family to choose her. She was 5 years old and alone, and no one protected her then. Today, I'm protecting her. Today, I'm choosing her over people who've done nothing but lie to both of us. Patricia broke down sobbing, but it wasn't the crying of remorse or genuine grief. It was the sobbing of humiliation of someone whose carefully constructed facade had just been demolished in the most public way possible. Daniel sat rigid beside her, his face a mask of barely controlled rage, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had gone white. Their own daughter had just destroyed them. The child they'd kept, the one they'd raised, the one they'd used as proof of their parental capacity, she'd stood up in court and called them liars, abusers, opportunists. There was no coming back from this. Preston attempted cross-examination, but his questions were weak, unfocused. He tried to suggest Sarah had been manipulated by me, but Sarah calmly explained she'd done her own investigation before ever contacting me. He tried to imply she was exaggerating their financial motivations, but she cited specific emails and conversations she'd overheard. Within minutes, he gave up and sat down. The courtroom remained silent as Sarah stepped down from the witness stand. She didn't return to her seat in the gallery. Instead, she walked to where I sat and took an empty chair beside me at the defense table. Marcus didn't object. Judge Anderson didn't stop her. She was making a choice about where she belonged, and everyone understood. The verdict came swiftly, but the consequences would last forever. Judge Anderson called for closing arguments, though at this point they felt almost unnecessary. The evidence had spoken with devastating clarity, and no amount of rhetoric from Preston could undo what had been laid bare. His closing was brief and half-hearted, a perfunctory performance from a lawyer who knew he'd already lost. Marcus's closing was equally concise, simply reminding the court that the evidence showed deliberate abandonment, financial opportunism, and a complete absence of parental love or concern. The court will take a brief recess to consider the evidence, Judge Anderson announced, and she left the bench. I expected deliberation to take hours. In complex civil cases, judges often retired to chambers for extended periods, reviewing documents and testimony, weighing legal precedents. But Judge Anderson returned in 40 minutes. The speed of her decision sent a clear message about how one-sided this case had been. We all rose as she entered and took her seat. The courtroom was packed now, more crowded than when we'd begun word having spread about the dramatic testimony. Sarah sat beside me at the defense table, her presence both comforting and surreal. My sister, the family I hadn't known I had. Judge Anderson looked down at her notes briefly, then directly at Daniel and Patricia Newman. When she spoke, her voice carried authority and unmistakable contempt. This court finds in favor of the defendant, Erica Newman, on all counts. The plaintiff's claim of wrongful adoption is denied in its entirety. Their claim to inheritance rights is denied in its entirety. Furthermore, this court finds that the lawsuit was filed in bad faith with malicious intent and no credible legal basis. She paused, letting those words settle over the courtroom. The evidence presented over the course of this trial shows not a family tragedy, but a family crime. You didn't lose your daughter, Mr. and Mrs. Newman. You discarded her. You threw her away deliberately with full knowledge of what you were doing, and you never looked back. Richard Hale's adoption was not only legal and properly documented, it was merciful. He gave Erica the family you refused to be. Daniel stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Patricia had stopped crying, her face now blank and emotionless, as if she'd retreated somewhere inside herself where the judge's words couldn't reach her. Your lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice, Judge Anderson continued, meaning you can never bring this claim again in any court. The evidence is conclusive. You have no legal or moral right to any part of Erica Newman's inheritance or her life. I felt Sarah's hand find mine under the table, squeezing tightly. This was it. The vindication I'd needed, the official declaration that I'd been right, that Richard had been right, that the life we'd built together was legitimate and good and untainted by their claims. But Marcus wasn't finished. He stood, and I felt a flutter of nervousness. We'd discussed this possibility, but I hadn't been certain we'd pursue it. Your Honor, the defense files a counterclaim. Preston's head snapped up, his expression alarmed. Judge Anderson raised an eyebrow. Proceed, Mr. Chen. Marcus presented documentation I'd signed days earlier authorizing him to sue Daniel and Patricia Newman for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and malicious prosecution. The damages requested were substantial $500,000. Preston struggled to his feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We weren't given notice. Judge Anderson cut him off. The counterclaim is valid and properly filed. Given that this trial has already established the relevant facts, I'm willing to hear arguments now if both parties are prepared. Mr. Chen, are you prepared to argue your counterclaim? I am your Honor. Mr. Preston? Preston looked at his clients desperately, but they had nothing to offer him. He'd been given no preparation time, his clients were financially destroyed already, and the facts were against him. Yes, Your Honor. We're prepared. Marcus laid out this counterclaim with the same systematic precision he'd shown throughout the trial. He demonstrated how the lawsuit had damaged my reputation, pointing to news articles that had questioned my legitimacy as Richard's daughter, that had suggested my inheritance might be based on fraudulent adoption. He showed how I'd been forced to relive the most traumatic experience of my life publicly to prove my own abandonment in open court. He documented the emotional toll, the sleepless nights, the therapy sessions I'd needed to process being dragged back into contact with the people who'd hurt me most. Furthermore, Marcus added, this lawsuit was a waste of court resources filed with no credible evidence and pursued despite multiple opportunities to withdraw. The plaintiffs demonstrated malicious intent through their own email correspondence, explicitly stating they wanted to pressure Judge Newman into settling by threatening her reputation. Preston offered a weak defense, arguing that his clients had believed their claim was valid, that they'd been acting on legal advice. But Judge Anderson was unmoved. After only 15 minutes of arguments, she delivered her ruling. I find in favor of the defendant on the counterclaim. Daniel and Patricia Newman are jointly and severally liable for damages in the amount of $350,000 plus court costs, totaling an additional $42,000. She looked at them coldly. You came here seeking money you didn't earn, claiming rights you'd forfeited 30 years ago. Instead, you'll pay for the damage you caused. Perhaps you'll finally understand that actions have consequences. The number was staggering, catastrophic for people who were already bankrupt. I watched the reality settle over Daniel and Patricia's faces. They didn't have $350,000. They didn't have $35,000. This judgment would follow them for the rest of their lives, placing liens on any assets they might acquire, garnishing any wages if they found employment, destroying any chance they had of financial recovery. They were ruined completely and permanently. Preston gathered his papers with shaking hands, refusing to look at his clients. I imagine he'd learned a valuable lesson about taking cases based solely on potential payout rather than merit. As Daniel and Patricia stood to leave, they moved like people in shock, their faces blank and lost. But the courtroom hadn't finished with them. As they pushed through the swinging gate separating the gallery from the counsel tables, reporters surged forward with cameras and microphones. Questions flew from all directions. Flashes burst, video cameras recorded their retreat. "Mr. Newman, do you have any response to the ruling?" "Mrs. Newman, do you regret abandoning your daughter? How do you respond to your other daughter's testimony against you?" They pushed through the crowd with their hands over their faces, trying to hide from the cameras, but there was no hiding now. Their shame was public record, documented in court transcripts and news footage preserved forever in the archives of their own greed and cruelty. Sarah didn't follow them. She remained seated beside me, her choice made clear to everyone in that courtroom. She'd chosen her family, and it wasn't the people who'd raised her on lies. It was the sister she'd never known, the woman who'd survived what they'd done and built something meaningful from the wreckage. I watched my biological parents disappear through the courtroom doors, reporters following them into the hallway. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction in their destruction. I felt only a profound sense of closure of a chapter finally, irrevocably ended. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. But he was wrong. The courtroom battle was over, yes. The legal vindication was complete. But the true price of their betrayal was still to come. The verdict had been delivered in a courtroom with perhaps 50 people present, but within hours the story had spread far beyond those walls. I'd underestimated how compelling the narrative would be to the general public, how perfectly it fit into existing conversations about family justice and the consequences of cruelty. By that evening, news outlets across the country were running the story. I saw the headlines on my phone as Sarah and I sat in my living room still processing what had happened. "Parents sue daughter, they abandoned Luz spectacularly." "Judge faces down birth parents who threw her away at 5. Sister testifies against parents in shocking inheritance case." And the story had everything media outlets craved: abandonment, redemption, courtroom drama, and justice definitively served. It touched on themes everyone understood: betrayal, greed, the question of what we owe our biological families versus what they owe us. The security footage of 5-year-old me being left in that mall became the visual anchor for every report, a heartbreaking image that made the story impossible to ignore. By the second day, Daniel and Patricia Newman had become nationally infamous. Their photos circulated on social media with captions calling them the most shameless parents in America. And worse. I watched the public reckoning unfold with a mixture of vindication and discomfort. Yes, they deserved to face consequences. But the virality of their downfall took on a life of its own, becoming entertainment for millions who'd never met any of us. Their address was doxed within 48 hours, posted on multiple platforms, despite violation of terms of service. Hate mail arrived at their house in such volume that their mail carrier complained. Reporters camped outside their home, recording footage of them closing curtains and refusing to come out. I felt no sympathy, but I also felt no satisfaction in watching them become objects of public spectacle. Patricia lost her part-time job at a grocery store. The manager released a statement saying it was due to media attention affecting store operations, which was corporate speak for customers were harassing our employees about her. Daniel was banned from his regular casino, not for the publicity, but because the casino didn't want to be associated with him. Their church, which had supported them through their supposed tragedy for 3 decades, quietly asked them to stop attending services. The pastor called it a period of reflection, but everyone understood it was permanent exile. Former friends stopped returning their calls. Neighbors who'd once brought casseroles and offered sympathy now avoided eye contact. They'd been publicly marked as people who'd commodified their own daughter's childhood trauma, who'd abandoned a 5-year-old and then tried to profit from her success 30 years later. There was no rehabilitation from that, no path back to normal life. Sarah, meanwhile, was experiencing something entirely different. The media coverage portrayed her as the hero sister who'd chosen truth over loyalty, justice over comfort. Parents at her school approached her with words of support and admiration. Her principal called her into the office not to reprimand, but to tell her to take all the time she needed, that her classroom would be covered, that her well-being mattered more than attendance policies. She moved out of her apartment temporarily, staying with me while she looked for a new place. Having her in my home felt strange and right. Simultaneously, this sister I'd only known for a few weeks, who nonetheless felt like family in ways that transcended time. We fell into easy rhythms, cooking dinner together, talking late into the evening, discovering the ways we were similar and the ways we were different. We shared mannerisms neither of us had realized were genetic, the way we both tucked our hair behind our left ear when nervous, how we both made the same skeptical expression when we didn't believe something, our identical laugh that started quiet and grew louder. We had similar taste in books, similar senses of humor, similar ways of processing emotion, talking through everything until we understood it fully. Sarah told me stories about her childhood that filled in gaps I hadn't known existed. I told her about Richard, about the life he'd given me, about the grief of losing him. We were building something neither of us had experienced before, a sibling relationship based on truth, on choice, on genuine affection, rather than obligation or shared trauma. One night, about 2 weeks after the trial, Sarah said something that made me cry. We were sitting on my couch drinking tea, talking about nothing particularly important, when she suddenly became serious. "I spent 28 years being their daughter," she said quietly. "I'd like to spend the rest of my life being your sister." I reached over and hugged her, unable to speak for a moment. When I finally found words, I said, "You already are. You've been my sister since the moment you chose to stand with me." 2 weeks after the verdict, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I didn't answer, letting it go to voicemail. When I listened to the message later, I heard Patricia's voice, small and defeated in a way I'd never heard before. "Erica, we need to talk. We made mistakes, and we're sorry. We just wanted to apologize. Maybe we could—" She paused, and I could hear her struggling to find words that would somehow undo 30 years of abandonment and a lawsuit filed in pure greed. "Please call back." I listened to the message once, then deleted it. Sarah was sitting nearby reading a book, but she looked up when she saw my expression. "Are you going to respond?" she asked. I shook my head, already opening my phone's settings to block the number. "She's not sorry for what she did. She's sorry she got caught and lost. That's not the same thing." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. "You don't owe her forgiveness." "I don't owe her anything," I said, finalizing the block. Some apologies come too late. Some apologies cost too little. And some apologies mean nothing when they're forced by consequences rather than conscience. The voicemail had been an attempt to ease their own guilt, to feel like they'd tried to make amends, to check a box that would let them tell themselves they weren't entirely irredeemable. But I had no obligation to grant them absolution, no responsibility to make them feel better about the choices they'd made. They'd abandoned me once. I wouldn't let them manipulate me into absolving them now. I put my phone away and returned my attention to Sarah, to the present, to the life I was building, that had nothing to do with the people who'd tried to destroy it. They'd lost their power over me, lost their ability to define my worth or determine my future. I'd won, not just in court, but in the larger battle of refusing to let their cruelty define who I became. And as one chapter closed, Erica was about to open a new one. After the trial concluded and the media firestorm began to settle, I requested a leave of absence from my judicial duties. The court administration granted it, immediately understanding that I needed time to process not just the trial itself, but everything it had dredged up from my past. For a month, I stepped away from the bench, from the steady rhythm of hearings and rulings that had structured my days for years. During that time, I found myself repeatedly returning to Richard's will and the video testimony he'd recorded. I must have watched that video a dozen times, studying his face, listening to his voice, trying to extract every possible meaning from his words. One phrase kept echoing in my mind: "May she use it to build the life she deserves." I'd been thinking about the inheritance in practical terms: financial security, perhaps buying a larger home, investing for the future. But Richard hadn't left me money just so I could live comfortably. He'd left it so I could do something meaningful, something that honored both his legacy and the child I'd been. The realization crystallized one evening as Sarah and I sat in my living room. She was grading papers and I was reviewing foundation documents for a children's advocacy nonprofit I'd been supporting for years. Suddenly, I understood what Richard had been trying to tell me, what he would have wanted me to do. "I'm going to start a foundation," I said aloud, the decision forming even as I spoke the words. Sarah looked up from her papers. "What kind of foundation?" "For children who've been abandoned or are stuck in foster care. Kids who need someone to choose them the way Richard chose me. I'll call it the Richard Hale Foundation." Sarah smiled and I saw tears in her eyes. "He would love that." Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into the planning process with the same intensity I'd brought to building my legal career. I allocated $1 million of my inheritance as seed funding, hired a nonprofit attorney to handle the incorporation paperwork, and began drafting a mission statement that captured what I wanted to accomplish. The final version read, "Every child deserves to be chosen, protected, and loved. We exist for the children still waiting for their Richard Hale." The words felt right, honoring the man who'd saved me while acknowledging that there were countless other children still waiting for someone to see them, to choose them, to give them the safety and stability they deserved. As word spread about the foundation, something unexpected happened. People began reaching out, offering to help. The first email came from Marcus Chen, my attorney who'd represented me throughout the trial. "Erica," he wrote, "I've been thinking about the direction of my practice. I've spent years on estate litigation, and while it's been successful, it hasn't been particularly meaningful. Would the Richard Hale Foundation benefit from having a legal advisor? I'd like to volunteer my services pro bono, helping with compliance contracts and any legal issues that arise. This case reminded me why I went to law school in the first place, to help people who need it. I'd be honored to be part of this." I accepted, immediately grateful beyond words. Marcus's expertise would be invaluable, and his willingness to volunteer meant more of the foundation's resources could go directly to helping children. Others followed. Dr. Helen Rodriguez, the forensic accountant who'd testified about my biological parents' financial desperation, emailed to offer her services managing the foundation's finances without charge. Former colleagues from my prosecutor days asked to serve on the board of directors. Local businesses reached out with donation offers. A web design company volunteered to build our website. A marketing firm offered to handle our publicity pro bono. The trial that had been meant to destroy me had instead rallied a community around my mission. People who'd followed the case, who'd been moved by the story of abandonment and resilience, wanted to be part of transforming that pain into something positive. News coverage of the foundation was overwhelmingly supportive. Editorial pieces praised what one writer called turning abandonment into advocacy. Several articles highlighted the irony that my biological parents' attempt to profit from my inheritance had instead inspired me to use that money to help children in situations similar to mine. Donations began arriving from strangers across the country. Small amounts, mostly $20 here, $50 there, from people who'd seen the news coverage and wanted to contribute. But they added up quickly. By the end of the first month, the Richard Hale Foundation had raised over $500,000 beyond my initial investment, far exceeding anything I'd anticipated. Sarah had been helping from the beginning, offering suggestions and feedback as I developed the foundation's structure. About 3 weeks in, she asked me directly if she could take on a more formal role. "I'm a teacher," she said. "I understand child development, trauma-informed education, how to reach kids who've been through difficult experiences. I want to help develop programs specifically for the children your foundation will serve. Would that be useful?" I felt my throat tighten with emotion. "Sarah, that would be incredible. I was hoping you'd want to be involved, but I didn't want to pressure you." "You're not pressuring me," she said firmly. "This is important to me too. Not just because you're my sister, but because I understand now how many children grow up with lies and trauma shaping their lives. If I can help even a few of them process their experiences in healthier ways than I did then, I want to do that." Sutsats. I created a position for her education director of the Richard Hale Foundation. Together we began developing curricula that addressed the specific challenges faced by abandoned and foster children. Age-appropriate materials that helped them understand that their situations weren't their fault, that being abandoned or removed from homes didn't mean they were unlovable or unworthy. Working together deepened our relationship in ways I hadn't expected. We spent late evenings in my dining room, which had become our unofficial foundation headquarters, surrounded by research papers and program drafts. We discovered we worked well together. Sarah's creative, empathetic approach, balancing my more systematic, legal-minded perspective. One night after we'd finalized a particularly difficult section of curriculum dealing with parental abandonment, Sarah looked at me across the table. "I can't undo what they did to you," she said quietly. "I can't give you back those years or take away that pain, but maybe I can help make sure fewer kids feel what you felt. Maybe we can create something that would have helped you when you were 5. I reached across the table and took her hand. "You already have helped me, Sarah. You chose me when it mattered most. You stood up in that courtroom and chose truth over comfort, chose me over the people who raised you. That meant everything." She squeezed my hand. "You're my sister. That's not negotiable anymore. It's not about biology or who raised whom. It's about choice, like you said. And I choose you." We were building more than a foundation. We were building the family we both deserved, the relationship that should have existed from the beginning if our biological parents had been capable of love and honesty. Out of their cruelty and deception, we were creating something genuine and good. But there was one person from the past who hadn't yet reappeared. The Richard Hale Foundation had been operating for 3 months when an unexpected visitor appeared at our small office. We'd rented a modest space in downtown, just Sarah and me, and one part-time administrator working to get programs established and partnerships formed with foster care agencies. I was reviewing grant applications when our administrator knocked on my door. "There's a woman here to see you," she said. "She says it's personal. Her name is Margaret Holloway." The name meant nothing to me initially. I stepped out of my office and saw a woman in her early 70s standing in our small reception area. She had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an air of nervous determination. Something about her face struck me as vaguely familiar, like a photograph I'd seen long ago but couldn't quite place. "Ms. Newman," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for seeing me. I'm Margaret Holloway. I was Richard's partner. We were together for 5 years from when you were about 12 until you were 17. I stood there processing this information, trying to reconcile it with my memories. I did have vague recollections of a woman who visited sometimes during my teenage years, someone Richard introduced as a friend, someone who'd been kind to me but never intrusive. But a partner. Someone he'd been in a relationship with. "I'm sorry," I said, recovering my composure. "Please come into my office." We sat down and Margaret looked around at the foundation materials covering my desk, the mission statement framed on the wall. "He would have loved this," she said softly. This is exactly what he would have wanted you to do." "You were his partner?" I asked, still trying to understand. Margaret smiled sadly. "He wanted to marry me. We talked about it seriously, but I got scared. I watched how hard he worked to raise you, how much emotional energy it took, how he prioritized your needs over everything else. I thought taking care of you was his burden, something he felt obligated to do. And I didn't want to be trapped by someone else's responsibility, didn't want my life to revolve around a child who wasn't mine. So I left." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "That was 20 years ago, and I've regretted it every day since. Not just because I lost Richard, but because I was so wrong about what you meant to him. You weren't his burden. You were his joy. You were the best thing that ever happened to him, and I was too selfish and short-sighted to see it." I felt a complicated mix of emotions, sadness that Richard had lost someone he loved because of me, but also a defensive anger on my own behalf. I hadn't asked to be abandoned. I hadn't asked Richard to save me. I'd just been a child who needed help. Margaret seemed to read my expression. "This isn't about making you feel guilty. You did nothing wrong. I did. I made a choice based on fear and selfishness, and I lost something precious because of it. I didn't come to Richard's funeral because I felt I'd forfeited that right. But I've been following your story, the trial, the foundation. And I needed you to know something important about Richard, something you might not fully understand." "What's that?" I asked. "He almost didn't adopt you," Margaret said. "The system was so complicated. His lawyer told him it might take years to finalize, that there would be home studies and evaluations and endless bureaucracy. Richard's friends, the few people he confided in, told him he was crazy to take on a traumatized child at his age. He was in his mid-50s, set in his ways with a comfortable life. They couldn't understand why he'd disrupt all of that." She leaned forward. I watched him wrestle with the decision for weeks. He'd come over to my place and we'd talk late into the night about whether he was doing the right thing, whether he could really handle being a parent, whether you'd be better off with a younger couple who had parenting experience. "He never told me he had doubts," I said quietly. "Because by the time the adoption was finalized, he had none. But in those early weeks, he struggled. And then one night he said something I'll never forget. 'If I don't do this, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what happened to that little girl. I can't live with that. She needs someone and I'm someone. That's enough.'" Margaret's voice broke slightly. "He chose the hard path because it was the right one. And later when I left because I couldn't handle the commitment, he never once considered giving you back. His friend suggested it, said maybe this was a sign that he should reconsider, that perhaps you'd be better with a traditional family. But he shut that down immediately. You were his choice, and he never regretted it, even when it cost him his chance at another relationship." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden box, worn and weathered. "Before he got sick, before the cancer became obvious, Richard called me. We hadn't spoken in years, but he asked me to meet him. He gave me this box and said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you. He said there were some things you needed to know, things he'd written down but couldn't say out loud. I should have given it to you at the funeral, but I was too much of a coward. I'm sorry it took me so long." My hands shook as I accepted the box. It was light, made of dark wood with a simple brass clasp. I opened it carefully and found a leather journal inside the pages, yellowed slightly with age. I opened to the first page and saw Richard's handwriting, neat and careful, dated just days after he'd brought me home from the mall. "Day 3 with Erica. She barely speaks, hardly eats. I found her crying in the bathroom at midnight, trying to be quiet so she wouldn't bother me. What if I fail her the way her parents did? What if I'm not enough? But I made her hot chocolate and we sat together until she fell asleep on the couch. Small victories." I turned pages, reading entries that documented my first year with him. His fears, his doubts, his small triumphs. She laughed today, a real laugh, because I tried to flip a pancake and it stuck to the ceiling. I felt like I'd won the lottery. If I can make her laugh, maybe I can help her heal. Another entry. "Every child deserves to feel chosen. I choose her every single day. Not because I have to, but because I want to. She's extraordinary, and I hope someday she'll believe that about herself. I reached the final entry dated about 6 months after I'd arrived. My vision blurred with tears as I read Richard's words. Today, Erica called me Dad. Not because I told her to, but because she wanted to. We were reading a bedtime story and she just said it naturally. "Good night, Dad." I kept my voice steady, said good night back, finished the story. But after I left her room, I sat in the hallway and cried. I've achieved many things in my life, built companies, made money, earned respect. But nothing will ever mean more than earning that title from this remarkable child. I am the luckiest man alive. I closed the journal and pressed it against my chest, feeling Richard's presence in every word, understanding for the first time the depth of what our relationship had meant to him. I'd always known he loved me, but seeing it documented in his private thoughts, reading his fears and joys and determination, made it real in a new way. Margaret stood to leave. He loved you more than anything, Erica. More than his work, more than his money, more than me. And that wasn't a burden, it was a gift. You gave his life meaning and purpose. I hope knowing that brings you some comfort. After she left, I sat alone in my office, holding the journal, crying tears that were somehow both sad and joyful. Richard had given me everything, and now, years after his death, he was still giving me gifts, still showing me love in ways I hadn't expected. And there was one place Erica needed to visit to close the circle. After receiving Richard's journal from Margaret, I found myself thinking constantly about beginnings and endings, about how the worst day of my life had led to meeting the best person I'd ever known. The approaching anniversary wasn't lost on me. November 6th would mark exactly 31 years since I'd been abandoned in Westfield Mall. I woke that morning with a clarity of purpose I hadn't expected. I needed to go back. Not because I was drawn to the trauma or wanted to wallow in painful memories, but because I needed to close that circle, to stand in that place as the woman I'd become, rather than the terrified child I'd been. Sarah offered to come with me, but I told her I needed to do this alone. She understood, hugging me tightly before I left and making me promise to call her when I was done. The drive to Westfield Mall took 40 minutes, and with each passing mile I felt my heart rate increase. I hadn't been back since that day. There'd been no reason to return, and every reason to avoid it. But today felt different. Today I was choosing to confront the geography of my past. The mall had changed significantly. New stores occupied spaces I vaguely remembered. The entrance had been renovated, the parking lot repaved and reorganized. Modern security cameras were everywhere, far more sophisticated than the grainy systems that had captured my abandonment in 1993. But despite the changes, the basic structure remained familiar. I walked through the entrance and navigated by instinct more than memory, my feet carrying me toward the department store that had housed the toy section. The store had been rebranded. The merchandise had changed, but when I reached the back corner, I recognized it immediately. The toy section still existed in roughly the same location. Instead of the toys I remembered from 1993, there were modern brands, electronic games, different dolls. But the layout was similar. The same corner position, the same approximate dimensions. I stood in what I believed was the exact spot where 5-year-old me had stood, clutching Mr. Hoppy, counting to 60 over and over, waiting for a mother who would never return. The memories flooded back with visceral intensity. The fear that had grown with each count. The confusion when 1 minute became 10, then 20, then longer. The moment I'd seen my parents walking away through the windows, the hope that had flickered when my mother glanced back, then the crushing realization that she was leaving deliberately. But standing there now, 31 years later, I experienced those memories differently. I could see that little girl with compassion rather than shame. She'd done nothing wrong. She'd been obedient, patient, trusting, all the things children are supposed to be. The fault had never been hers. She'd been worthy of love and protection, and the fact that her biological parents hadn't provided those things said everything about them and nothing about her. This realization had been intellectual for years, something I understood in my mind. But standing in that spot, feeling the weight of those memories while simultaneously holding the knowledge of everything I'd become. It finally settled emotionally into truth. The 5-year-old me and the 36-year-old me were the same person, and both versions deserved love and respect. "Excuse me, miss, are you all right?" I turned to find an elderly security guard approaching, concern evident on his face. He wore the same type of uniform James Whitmore had worn 31 years ago, though this one bore the mall's new logo. And then I looked at his face more carefully and recognized him. "Mr. Whitmore," I said, stunned. He squinted at me clearly, trying to place my face. Then his eyes widened with recognition. "Judge Newman, what are you—" He paused, looking around at the toy section, understanding dawning. "Oh, you're here because—" "It's been 31 years today," I said. "I needed to come back." James gestured to a nearby bench and we sat down together. He looked older than when I'd seen him at the trial. The months had added visible weight to his already considerable years, but his eyes remained sharp and kind. "I think about you every year on November 6th, he confessed. "For decades I worried about what happened to you. I'd lie awake at night wondering if you'd ended up in a bad situation, if I should have done more, if there was something I missed that could have helped you. When I saw you on the news during the trial, when I learned what you'd become—" His voice broke slightly. "I cried, if I'm honest. You took the worst thing that could happen to a child and used it to protect other children. You're extraordinary." I shook my head, feeling tears gather. "I'm just someone who got lucky. Richard Hale saved me. Without him, I don't know what would have happened." "But you still had to survive," James insisted. "You still had to choose not to let that trauma destroy you. You still had to build something meaningful from the pain. That was you, not just Richard." We sat together in comfortable silence for a few moments, two people connected by one terrible day 3 decades ago, both of us processing how that day had rippled through our lives in different ways. Before leaving the mall, I stopped in the toy section and bought a stuffed rabbit. It wasn't identical to Mr. Hoppy. The toys had changed too much over 30 years, but it was similar. Soft, floppy-eared, with button eyes and a gentle expression. The cashier smiled as she rang it up, probably assuming I was buying it for a child in my life. In a way, I was. This rabbit would go to the Richard Hale Foundation, where it would be given to a child entering foster care. A small comfort from someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be scared and alone, holding on to something soft, while the world fell apart around you. As I walked out of Westfield Mall, carrying my symbolic purchase, I felt something shift inside me. The place that had once represented the absolute nadir of my life, the moment when I'd learned I was disposable to the people who should have loved me most, now represented something different. It represented survival. It represented transformation. It represented the beginning of the life that led me to Richard, to my career, to Sarah, to the foundation. I wasn't defined by what happened in that mall. I was defined by what I'd done afterward, by the choices I'd made, by the woman I'd become, despite the cruelty I'd experienced. The scared 5-year-old was still part of me. I could feel her presence, her fears, her resilience. But so was the strong 36-year-old woman who'd built a life of purpose and meaning. Both versions could exist together. The child who'd been abandoned, and the adult who'd survived. The victim and the victor. The wounded and the healed. As I reached my car, I whispered words meant for my younger self, for the little girl who'd stood in that toy section counting to 60. "We made it. We're okay now." And 1 week later, the foundation would receive a visitor that stunned everyone. 1 week after my visit to the mall, the Richard Hale Foundation officially opened its first resource center. We'd found a space in downtown, a renovated building that had once been a community center with rooms for tutoring, counseling offices, a small legal clinic, and most importantly, a comfortable common area where children could simply exist without pressure or judgment. The grand opening ceremony drew over 200 people. Foster parents came curious about the services we'd offer. Social workers attended hopeful for another resource in an overwhelmed system. Former foster children, now adults, showed up to support what we were building. Community members who'd followed my story came to be part of something positive. Local news stations set up cameras covering the event as a continuation of the narrative that had captivated the region months earlier. I stood at the podium looking out at the crowd at Sarah sitting in the front row, giving me an encouraging smile at Marcus and the other board members at faces I recognized, and many I didn't. I'd been mentally writing this speech for 30 years, long before I knew I'd ever give it. I was abandoned at 5 years old in a mall. I began my voice steady, despite the emotion churning inside me. I was left to believe I was unwanted and disposable, that something fundamental about me made me unworthy of love. But one man saw me differently. Richard Hale taught me that family isn't about biology. It's about choice, commitment, and love that shows up every single day. I paused, gathering myself. This foundation exists because every child deserves what Richard gave me. Someone who chooses them, who believes in them, who never gives up on them. We exist for the children still waiting for their person, for the kids who wonder if anyone will ever see them and decide they're worth the effort. We exist to say, you are worth it. You always were. The applause was warm and sustained, but as it died down, something unexpected happened. James Whitmore stood from his seat and approached the microphone. I stepped aside, surprised, as he cleared his throat nervously. "I'd like to say something, if that's all right," he said, looking at me for permission. I nodded, curious. "My name is James Whitmore. I was the security guard who found Erica in 1993. He paused as recognition rippled through the crowd. "I did my job that day. I called the police, I filed the reports, I stayed with her until they figured out what to do. But for 30 years I've carried guilt. I've wondered if I could have done more, if I should have fought harder, if there was something I missed that would have made a difference." His voice grew stronger. "When I saw Erica on the news, when I learned she'd become a judge, when I testified at that trial and saw the woman she'd become, I cried. But I also realized something: the best way to honor that little girl isn't to dwell on what I didn't do. It's to help with what she's doing now." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "This is a check for $50,000. It's my entire retirement savings. This is for the children who need someone to see them the way I saw Erica. Maybe it can't change the past, but it can change someone's future." The crowd erupted in applause and several people stood. I felt tears streaming down my face as I hugged James, this man who'd carried unnecessary guilt for 3 decades because he cared enough to wonder if he'd done enough. "You already saved me once," I whispered. "You don't owe me anything." James hugged me back and I heard him say quietly, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it with you." The ceremony concluded with refreshments and tours of the facility. People lingered, asking questions about programs and volunteer opportunities. The energy was hopeful, purposeful, exactly what I'd hoped to create. Later that afternoon, as people were leaving and we were cleaning up, Sarah's phone rang. She answered, listened, and her expression changed. She found me immediately. "We have a little girl," she said, her voice tight with emotion. 6 years old. Found wandering alone in Jefferson Park about an hour ago. Police think she was abandoned. She's scared, won't talk. Just like..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. I grabbed my keys. "I'm going." When I arrived at the center 20 minutes later, I found the little girl sitting on the couch in our common room. She clutched a worn backpack against her chest, her eyes wide with the same fear I remembered feeling 31 years ago. A police officer stood nearby, looking relieved when I entered. I knelt down to her eye level, just as Richard had done for me, and asked the same question he'd asked. "Are you cold? Would you like some hot chocolate?" The girl nodded almost imperceptibly. I wrapped a soft blanket around her shoulders and sat beside her, not too close, giving her space to feel safe. Sarah entered with this promised hot chocolate, and together we simply sat with this frightened child, letting her know through our presence that she wasn't alone anymore. As I watched Sarah gently talking to the little girl, explaining that she was safe now, that we would figure everything out together, I felt something profound settle into place. The cycle had been broken. The abandoned child was now the protector. The legacy Richard started continued through me, through Sarah, through this foundation that bore his name. History wasn't repeating. It was being redeemed one child at a time. I was abandoned at 5 years old, but today I choose who I become. And I choose to be the person I needed back then. If Erica's story moved you, if you felt the pain of that 5-year-old girl abandoned in a mall and the triumph of the woman who turned that trauma into purpose, please subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that chosen family can be more powerful than biology, that our worst moments don't have to define us. What part of Erica's journey resonated most with you? Was it Richard's unconditional love? Sarah's courage to choose truth over comfort? Or Erica's decision to transform pain into protection for others? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters too, and this community is here to listen. Remember, you're not defined by what was done to you. You're defined by what you choose to do next. Thank you for being here. Until next time.